There's this lake that my brother and I used to fish. We'd use live bait, usually crickets or worms, and we'd catch a ton of bluegill. It was a fun time, and some of those early memories are the reason I've been such an avid fisherman for most of my life. The lake wasn't the most popular fishing spot, despite being pretty well stocked from what I can remember. I think most of the locals just found it inconvenient and inaccessible unless you were prepared to hike through the woods a bit, which my brother and I always were. The seclusion was actually one of my favorite things about it, almost like I was sharing a private activity that not everyone got to experience. Everyone knows the best lake fishing happens during periods of low light, meaning early morning or late evening. It's more customary to wake up at the crack of dawn and get out early, but my brother and I developed this habit of going out later in the day and staying into the night. It was our substitute for whatever most high school kids did at that time of night on the weekend, probably partying and whatnot. It was a Friday night, and everything was going according to plan. We reached the lake just as the sun started to set, and by the time we were all baited up, the sun was already starting to dip. We were positioned at the edge of the lake on this little formation of rocks that made a good comfortable surface for us and all our excess gear. It was something we had done hundreds of times. As we were fishing though, something caught my eye on the far side of the lake. There was movement in the water, and by the sheer rippling of it, I was surprised it had taken me so long to notice. I pointed it out to JJ, and the two of us strained our eyes in confusion, wondering what was causing it. Keep in mind, this lake was pretty sizable, and when coupled with the low visibility, it wasn't like you could see perfectly clearly across it. But then, as we were both looking at the ripples in the water, something happened that I would have never expected, not in a million years. A dark mass started rising out of the water where the ripples had been, and as it emerged, my assumption that it had been a huge fish was immediately dispelled. It was not a fish. It was way too big and way too upright. There was only one explanation, really. I think my brother and I realized it at the same time, because I heard him curse at the same time I did. It was a person. Think about how strange that is on its own. Not only was there a literal person in a somewhat private lake after sunset, but they had just been submerged below the surface. And not just that, they must have been down there for quite some time too. Otherwise we would have noticed them earlier. It was freaky enough to quicken my heartbeat a little, and I got this compelling urge to leave. My brother didn't want to though, saying that we had just gotten out there, and that person in the lake was too far away to have any kind of effect on us. I figured he wasn't wrong, so the two of us spent the next few minutes watching the person in the lake, trying to rationalize the sight. They were swaying back and forth, rhythmically, almost hypnotically. Their movements weren't jerky or choppy, but perfectly fluid, like they were commanding the water around them as opposed to merely cutting through it. Our fishing poles were all but neglected at that point, lying there untouched while the two of us kept our attention fixated on the strange sight across the lake. Was it possible they were fishing? No, that seemed ridiculous. Fishing underwater? Unheard of. JJ suggested that maybe they were enjoying a night swim, which was plausible, until I grazed the surface of the lake with my hand and instantly recoiled at how cold it was. You'd have to be a psycho to enjoy swimming in temperatures that low. Without much else to do besides ignore them and keep fishing, I snapped out of my trance and encouraged my brother to do the same. But when I looked over at him, I realized that he was either much more invested or much more scared than I was, maybe both. Instead of heeding my advice, he sat there motionlessly with his lips slightly parted and his eyes glued to the lake. He wasn't even holding his fishing pole anymore. I said his name a few times in frustration before he finally averted his gaze, instinctively picking his fishing pole back up. With a little shake of his hand, he said sorry, and the two of us tried to resume fishing, although it was pretty clear that our attention was elsewhere. I'm not really sure what I expected to happen. I guess I figured that person would eventually get out of the lake, or notice us, or do something other than just stand there. After a few minutes of mindlessly casting and reeling, JJ tapped my shoulder and said, "Look." I looked back across the lake just in time to see that person submerge again, disappearing below the surface. I found myself staring at the spot they had just been, expecting them to reappear any second, but they didn't. A minute passed, and then another. It dawned on me that JJ had his phone out with the stopwatch running. As it ticked up past 2 minutes, I grew increasingly astonished at how long they were holding their breath. JJ theorized that maybe it was someone training, and I almost laughed at the thought of an Olympic diver testing their lung capacity out there, in a freezing cold lake in the middle of nowhere after the sun had set. Suddenly, the thought wasn't so funny anymore, and I started packing up, telling JJ we were leaving. But he held me back, saying he wanted to wait and see how long they could hold their breath for. I told him fine, but gathered up our stuff anyway, feeling that urge to leave start creeping back in. Just before the 3-minute mark, I noticed ripples in the water again, only this time they were much, much closer, 1/5 of the way out instead of all the way on the other side. The realization that this person had not only held their breath for nearly 3 minutes, but had done so while swimming was enough for me to raise my voice at JJ. This time he didn't argue, and the two of us stood up, preparing to leave. But we couldn't go just yet. The curiosity was far too strong. JJ and I watched as the person started emerging again, and this time we could see them clear as day. To my utter surprise, it was actually a woman, not a man like I had anticipated. She had long brown hair and was wearing what looked like a dark green swimsuit. And there was one more thing I need to mention. She was kind of beautiful. She didn't look much older than we were, maybe a year or two if I had to guess. The moment I saw her, I instantly felt less intimidated, less scared too. I started wondering if maybe my brother and I had been too hasty with our intention to leave. The two of us were still frozen in place though, and she was actually the one who broke the silence. She flashed an alluring smile and said, "Hi," almost like she was trying to be playful and coy, like she hadn't just held her breath for 3 minutes while swimming through a freezing cold lake. She was definitely a strong swimmer. It was obvious from the way she bobbed around, seeming just as comfortable in the water as most people would on land. I was dumbfounded, too perplexed to speak, but my brother blurted out the question I was dying to ask. He asked her what she was doing, and I had to remind myself that she was behaving like a crazy person, as harmless as she looked. She leaned her head back and said she was swimming. My brother said, "Well, yeah, obviously," then asked her if she was training for something. She gave us another teasing smile and said something like that, then glided a little closer to us. Then she actually asked us if we wanted to join her. Pure insanity. I spoke up for the first time, asking her if she was crazy and telling her the water was freezing. She laughed and called us bitches, then said we'd get used to the temperature fast. JJ said no, and she started glaring at us with a finger on her lip like she was thinking. I don't know if it was her cavalier attitude or the icy look in her eye, but the alarm bell started ringing, and I was terrified all over again. There were so many things I wanted to ask her. Who was she? Was she alone? How long had she been out there? Did she live nearby? But I didn't. Instead, I just grabbed JJ's shoulder and told the pretty lake girl we were leaving. I'm not sure what I was expecting her to do, but I definitely wasn't expecting her to start screaming. She screamed no at the top of her lungs, and I stumbled backwards out of pure shock. My brother and I made sure we weren't leaving any of our stuff behind and then started running away from the lake. She kept screaming after us though. She was yelling for us to come back and get in the water. As if that wasn't horrifying enough, she just started shrieking at one point. Not words, just shrieking. It sounded like someone being stabbed. I could still hear her behind us by the time we were halfway back to the car. Part of me was expecting her to get out of the water and start chasing us, but I don't know if she ever did. By the time we made it back to the car, JJ already had the police on the line. He told them what had happened, and even though they asked us to stay nearby so they could question us, he told them he didn't feel comfortable doing that, then hung up. I probably would have done the same thing. That's how badly I wanted to get out of there. You might think the experience would have discouraged my brother and I from continuing to fish there, and it did, but only for a while. We actually did go back a fair amount, though for the first handful of outings we made sure to bring our dad with us. It took some convincing to get him to believe us, but he ultimately did. He was pretty curious and wanted to see this strange girl for himself, but we never saw her again. For all we knew, the police had found her and dealt with her however they decided to. It became somewhat of a shared joke between my brother and I. It actually got to a point where every time we fished that lake, a little part of us wanted to see her again. But now that more time's passed, and that lake is no longer part of my life, I'd begun to recognize the strangeness and horror of it all. She was probably just mentally ill. That's the explanation I ultimately decided on. My brother has some interesting theories of his own, but I find them all silly and unrealistic. Either way, I doubt anything as unexplainable and as strange as what happened that night will ever happen to me again. My name's Jay, and fishing is one of life's greatest pleasures. I take every opportunity I can to get out on the water, whether it's a lake, river, or the marshes down here in Louisiana. This happened about 2 months ago when I was out with my friend Angel, who's just as obsessed with fishing as I am. We decided to go marsh fishing for speckled trout, something we'd done plenty of times before. The marshes around here are pretty shallow, so we took out my 2-person kayak like we always do. It was early spring, so it was still pretty cold outside, and the water was even colder, but we didn't care. We'd been paddling for about 30 minutes when we found a good spot that looked promising. The marsh seemed completely empty that day, no other fishermen around, which was exactly how we liked it. We cracked open a couple of beers and got right to the fishing, just enjoying the peace and quiet. We'd been fishing for maybe an hour when Angel hooked something decent, at least from the looks of it. As he was reeling it in, he got a little too excited and leaned over the side of the kayak to get a better angle. I knew what was about to happen the second before it did, but I couldn't speak up in time. As he was leaning over, I watched helplessly as his phone slid out of his jacket pocket and plunged into the muddy water. Safe to say, Angel was frustrated as hell. He said he had insurance that would cover damage to his phone, but not if it was completely lost. He said the replacement would cost several $100s that he didn't have, and I didn't fault him for it one bit. I'm not exactly drowning in cash myself. I told him we'd try to find it, even though the water was so murky you couldn't see more than a few inches down. We spent the next 20 minutes in that same area using our paddles to try and feel something hard on the bottom, but it was hopeless. The marsh bottom was all mud and vegetation, and even though both of us had seen the phone fall into the water, we started second-guessing where we should even be looking. Finally, I told Angel we weren't going to find it and we might as well try to salvage some enjoyment from the day, but he shook his head and said he wasn't leaving without that phone. Before I could stop him, Angel started taking off his shoes and pants. He said he was going to wade into the marsh and try to feel around for the phone with his feet. I thought it wasn't a half-bad idea, actually. At least it was better than poking around with paddles. The moment Angel stepped into the water, he let out a string of curses about how cold it was. That spot of the marsh was actually deeper than I'd expected, about 4.5 feet judging by where the water came up on Angel's body. But he was determined, so he started feeling around with his feet in the area where he thought his phone had dropped. I watched from the kayak, getting more impatient by the minute. The water was so cold that I knew Angel couldn't stay in there for much longer, and I was hoping he'd either find the phone quickly or give up and get back on the kayak. But then, out of nowhere, Angel yelled out and his whole body flipped forward. 1 second he was standing upright in the water, and the next second he was completely submerged. At first I thought maybe he'd slipped on the muddy bottom, or maybe he'd actually found his phone and dove down to grab it. But after a few seconds passed without Angel resurfacing, I realized something was seriously wrong. I didn't even think. I just started yanking off my shoes and jacket, preparing to jump in after him. Before I could get in the water, though, Angel burst up from the marsh, covered head to toe in filthy muck and mud, and he was screaming at me to get out of there as fast as possible. I helped pull him back into the kayak, and we started paddling away from that spot as quickly as we could. Angel was shaking, and not just from the cold water by the looks of it. He kept looking back over his shoulder at the water like he expected something to follow us. Once we were a decent distance away, I asked him what had happened down there. Angel said that while he was feeling around for the phone with his feet, something had grabbed his ankle and yanked him under. He had a hard time describing what it felt like. He said it wasn't exactly a hand, but it wasn't a tentacle or a set of teeth either, just something that wrapped around his ankle with incredible strength. According to Angel, after he went under, whatever had grabbed him tried to drag him away from where we had been fishing. He said he fought against it with everything he had, kicking and struggling, until he finally managed to break free from its grip. We called it a day and headed back to the boat launch, despite Angel not having found his phone. But that clearly wasn't what was on his mind. The whole ride back, He barely said a word. I kept trying to convince him that maybe it had been a big catfish or an alligator gar that had grabbed him. But at the end of the day, I hadn't been the one to feel it, so I couldn't exactly convince him of anything. Angel insisted that what grabbed him didn't feel like any fish or animal he'd ever encountered. He was so unsettled and manic that I honestly started to feel spooked myself. I mean, what could that thing have been? My mind started wandering, and it didn't lead me anywhere good. I've been fishing those marshes for years, and I've never experienced anything like what Angel described. Even after doing a bunch of research online, I was never able to find anything conclusive. Part of me wants to go back to that spot and see if we could figure out what's down there, but I'm not eager to do that anytime soon. I will say that every time I've been marsh fishing since then, I felt this sense of unease that should never accompany something as enjoyable as fishing. This story happened about 2 months ago, and it's something I still think about from time to time. It was me, Kat, Nick, and Megan, the usual crew for weekend adventures. We'd been looking for something to do on a Saturday evening, and Nick brought up this reservoir near Megan's house that we'd been to several times before. It's kind of a classic spot amongst our friend group. Nick and I knew it was stocked with bass, so we were eager to get some fishing in since the two of us are pretty obsessed with the activity. Kat and Megan were just excited to drink a little at the water's edge and maybe go for a dip if they were feeling adventurous enough. Megan's house is way out in the sticks, and the reservoir is maybe a 10-minute drive away, followed by a short walk through some woods behind her neighborhood. It's technically county property, which is obvious from the many no trespassing signs posted every few yards along the chain-link fence that surrounds it, but Megan had cut a hole in the fence ages ago. We laughed about it every time we went there, joking about how we'd found this perfect hidden spot that nobody else knew about. The reservoir itself is pretty small. It's surrounded by thick woods on 3 sides and a small access road on the 4th. The water's crystal clear, and there's this little sandy area where we usually set up. We call it the beach because of the sand and the fact that there are some flat rocks perfect for lounging on. It really is a nice spot. And since it's so secluded, we can blast music and be rowdy without worrying about disturbing anyone. The sun was already going down by the time we made it through the fence. Nick and I immediately started setting up our fishing gear, even though we both knew we probably wouldn't be doing much fishing. The girls spread out a blanket and got right to the drinking. It was a vibe, especially since I had a little thing for Megan, and Nick for Kat. As the girls were debating going for a little dip, Kat pointed something out that none of us had noticed before. She was squinting down the bank, asking if we saw that canoe over there. We all looked in the direction she was pointing. Sure enough, a little ways down the shoreline was a canoe wedged into some reeds near the edge of the water. It was positioned oddly, like it had just drifted there without being tied off properly. The weird thing was, we'd been to the reservoir dozens of times over the past year alone, and none of us had ever seen a canoe there before. Nick and I are both pretty curious by nature, and the canoe was close enough that we figured we might as well go check it out. The girls seemed more interested in their music and drinks, so they waved us off when we said we're gonna investigate. The walk along the bank took maybe 3 minutes. As we approached the canoe, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't just an empty canoe. It looked like someone had been using it recently and then just left. Like there was a fishing rod with its line still dangling into the water, alongside a tackle box lying open like someone had been digging through it. That wasn't the only thing. There was a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic sitting on the seat. But the strangest thing by far was the phone. It was sitting right there on the main seat, locked but with the flashlight on. I pointed it out to Nick, asking who just leaves their phone behind like that. Nick shrugged, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. All the other stuff, the fishing gear, even the sandwich, could be explained easily. Maybe someone had heard us coming, knew they were trespassing, and took off before they could get caught. But leaving behind a perfectly good cell phone, that's not something any rational person does, no matter how scared they are. I looked at Nick and then back at the canoe, taking everything in at once. I know it doesn't sound super creepy, but in the moment, it was one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen. If you were there, you would have felt the same. There was still enough light out that we should have been able to see whoever the canoe belonged to if they were anywhere nearby. We looked around the immediate area, but there was no one there. Nick said it was weird, and I agreed completely. The two of us headed back to the girls and told them what we found. The more I described the contents of the canoe, the more unsettled I felt. I remember looking back over at it, feeling this rising feeling of foreboding as I watched it gently drift back and forth in the water. The four of us talked it over for a few minutes, throwing around theories, but none of our explanations really made sense when you factored in the phone. Kat said she wanted to get out of there, and honestly, I agreed. The whole situation was giving me a bad feeling. We started packing up our stuff when Megan gasped and pointed across the reservoir. I followed her gaze and literally had to do a double take. On the far side of the water was a person standing knee-deep in the reservoir. Even though the sun had just set, I could see them clearly. They had something long in their hands that looked like it could have been a fishing rod or maybe a stick. But what really freaked me out was the fact that they were just standing there perfectly still, facing in our direction. It dawned on me that they were watching us, and they probably had been for a while. All of a sudden, the creepiness of having seen that abandoned canoe turned into straight-up fear. None of us said it out loud, but I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. We needed to get out of there immediately. We grabbed our stuff and started heading back toward the fence. We weren't quite running, but we were moving fast. And then came the thing I had been dreading. That guy started yelling after us, screaming that we shouldn't be there and to get out. That's exactly what we were doing, but he didn't seem to care. He was belligerent, and the way he kept screaming and cursing made him sound like a lunatic. I didn't think it could get much worse than that, but I turned around just in time to see him drop whatever he had been holding and start moving into deeper water. It took me 2 seconds to realize what was happening. He was swimming across the reservoir. I screamed at my friends to run, and we took off. We sprinted back to the hole in the fence and squeezed through as fast as we could. I was in the back, and as I was crawling through, I could hear splashing from the direction of the water. I made it through, and the four of us booked it in the car and sped out of there as quickly as we could. For the next 20 minutes, we sat in Megan's driveway trying to make sense of what had happened. Kat was really shaken up, and Nick was trying to calm her down, but it didn't look like it was working. She was practically in tears, and I couldn't blame her. I was still pretty freaked out myself. None of us knew what to think. I wondered if that person screaming at us had been the owner of the canoe, and if so, why was their canoe all the way across the reservoir? And why were they in the reservoir in the first place? Or, and this is the one that really got to me, had that person done something to whoever the canoe belonged to? But as Megan pointed out, that didn't make much sense considering the fact that they chased us, drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Kat wanted to call the police, but what would we tell them? That we were trespassing and found an abandoned canoe? That someone yelled at us to get out of a place we weren't supposed to be in the first place? Not an option. It's been a few months since the incident, and we haven't been back to the reservoir since then. Part of me wants to go back there for answers, but I haven't been able to convince the girls or even Nick to come with me. It's probably for the best. I don't think I'm going to forget about how creepy the whole thing was anytime soon, though. I once worked as a direct care aide for a 65-year-old woman with a developmental disability. Her daughter, who was in her 40s, worked overnights, and she needed a caretaker with medical experience to watch her overnight. When I say once worked for them, I mean I literally worked once, just this night, and you're about to hear why I never went back. The 65-year-old woman's name was Martha. Her daughter's name, who contacted me, was named Colleen. It's possible Colleen didn't have any other family to watch her and didn't want to or couldn't afford to put Martha in a nursing home. Or it was possible that she felt more comfortable hiring somebody with some form of experience to watch over her. At the time, I was already a direct care worker for 2 other women who suffered some forms of developmental disabilities, so I had experience. But nothing prepared me for that night. Colleen left for work. Earlier that day, I worked my first job, so I was really pushing my body to exhaustion, trying to make as much money as possible. Colleen had introduced Martha and I. Martha had given me a smile before Colleen brought her upstairs to her bedroom for the night. It was around 9 p.m. Colleen told me that Martha would sometimes walk around the house at night acting confused, and I'd need to calm her down and bring her back to her room. She specifically addressed this not to be a form of sleepwalking when I asked. She said it's one of the symptoms of her mother's dementia. I told her to rest assured that I'd know how to handle it. I spent my time initially in the living room catching up on my show. These jobs aren't super glamorous, and for the most part, it is a lot of sitting around. I heard footsteps from upstairs. I went to the stairway and looked up the stairs, then called Martha's name, asking if she needed anything. She didn't answer. I heard her footsteps go back to her room, and then the door closed. Maybe she went to the bathroom. I went back to the living room and watched some more TV. It was maybe an hour later that I got up to grab my sandwich that I brought from the fridge. As I left the kitchen with a plate and my sandwich to go back to the couch, I nearly had a heart attack and dropped the plate when I saw Martha standing at the doorway. Glass shattered everywhere. I apologized to her and asked if she was okay. She started yelling at me, "Who are you?" I reminded her who I am. I'm her direct care worker here to make sure she's okay. Everything she said at this point was in a loud scream. "Why are you here? I don't know you," things of that nature. I reminded her that we had just met, and that her mother Colleen hired me to watch her and the house. This seemed to work for long enough for me to get her to come back upstairs with me and to her room. I brought her up a glass of water and some melatonin and clonazepam. I made sure she took both before going back downstairs. After a few hours, I was absolutely exhausted. I had to get a couple hours of shut-eye. There was a spare bedroom upstairs with a twin-size bed where Colleen said I could rest if needed. I felt like at this point Martha was asleep for the night from the melatonin. I fell asleep within minutes, but I was asleep for only maybe an hour. I woke up to a sound from downstairs. It was this repeated slamming. Every 1 to 2 seconds, something from downstairs was being slammed. I jumped out of the bed. I had left the bedroom door open so that I'd hear anything if Martha got up, case in point right here. When I got to the stairs, I realized the slamming was coming from the kitchen. I walked down the stairs in as quick of a speed as I could while still remaining quiet. Getting to the bottom, I peered around the opening to the kitchen, and what I saw was like a scene from a scary movie I'd seen before. I saw Martha in the darkness, standing in front of the oven, repeatedly opening it and slamming it shut. It was horrifying. When I say I saw Martha, I really only saw her silhouette. It was that dark in the kitchen. I said "Martha" really loudly, and she stopped, turned to her left at me, shut the oven door one final time, and started walking towards me, towards the stairs. I said in a now softer, kind of scared-sounding voice, "Are you okay?" She got close enough to me where I could now see her facial features, and she looked at me with this blank expression, then walked right past me and started walking up the stairs. I followed her upstairs, but as soon as she got to her room, she slammed her door shut. I knocked on the door saying, "Martha, are you alright?" She didn't respond. I quietly opened the door just to peek inside, and I saw Martha at the side of her bed, just standing facing the wall. I've seen a lot, but this was some pretty unsettling behavior that I feel like is the exact kind of stuff you'd see in some scary movies, like I mentioned before. I walked over to her and gently eased her into the bed. When she was laying down, I covered her, and for what I was hoping would be the final time, I said "Goodnight, Martha," and shut her door. I went across the upstairs to the spare room and went back to bed. I purposely tried not to fall asleep for at least half an hour just in case she'd wake up again, but I don't even know if I made it that long. All I know is I fell asleep pretty freaking quickly. I woke up once again, however much later. The room was still pitch black, and the 1-hour alarm I set had not yet gone off. I looked around the room, wondering what woke me up. I didn't see what it was until I heard a sound from inside the closet. I then noticed the cracked open closet door, and the black shadow of a head peeking out of the closet. Again, I almost had a heart attack. I said "Martha." She didn't answer. I kept saying "Martha" a bunch of times until she pushed the door open, and I saw her approaching the bed slowly. She started saying what she was saying hours ago again. "Who are you? I don't know you." As she got closer, I tried calming her down, reminding her who I am. I reached for the lamp next to the bed and fumbled with it until it turned on. Martha was holding a huge kitchen knife in her hand. At this moment, everything changed. Martha was now a threat to my life, and I had to worry about myself, not her.
I screamed at this point. Martha put the knife down. I guess my scream stressed her out because she got closer and started screaming back at me, still repeating, "I don't know you." I wasn't going to attempt to calm down a knife-wielding dementia patient. That was not in any job description. I mapped out a way to run around her in the bedroom, and I went for it. I jumped off the bed on the side further from her, and she screamed again, "Who are you?" She swung the knife at the air as I ran past her. It was a slow and weak swipe from what I saw, but nonetheless showed that she had intentions of actually using it. I got downstairs and grabbed my shoes and went outside. Instead of calling 911, I called Colleen as she requested I do if there's an issue. I was courteous in doing this because getting law enforcement involved is never doing anyone any favors. Colleen was yelling into the phone at me not to leave her, and honestly I yelled back that she attempted to kill me and that I didn't call the police. She had to leave work, of course. I stayed outside of the house, making sure Martha didn't go anywhere until Colleen returned. When Colleen went inside, Martha was back in her bed asleep. Colleen went as far as accusing me of exaggerating the whole thing until she found the knife next to Martha's bed. To not give her any more fuel to blame me for any of this, I left out the fact that I ever went to sleep. But that doesn't mean that I felt in any way I did anything wrong. Colleen even offered me that room to sleep. I never worked in that house again. Martha was a scarier patient than I'd ever dealt with in any of my jobs in my 9 years of being a direct care aide. It was my first day working for this plumbing company. I was called in for my first job to this house out of town. The plumbing company had 5 employees, and the owner would choose who does what job. I don't see it as a coincidence that I was sent to some undesirable job far away in a shitty area for my first job. The call was for a leaky pipe under the sink, which is typically the easiest, most basic job to get a call for, depending on the root cause of it. I pulled up to the house, my first ever call, and it was an absolutely disgusting looking house, completely run down as if no one had lived there for years. I went up to the house and knocked until a middle-aged man opened the door. I didn't like his aura from the start. He had this unflattering, disproportionately wide smile that made his entire face appear off-putting. His voice was also really soft and high-pitched, not the voice I was expecting to come out of his mouth. Or maybe it was, given his unusual appearance. He welcomes me inside of the house. I realized there wasn't a single piece of furniture in the house. "Just moved in?" I asked him. He replied yes and then chuckled. Or maybe I should say he giggled because it was just a weird, high-pitched little laugh. He brought me to the kitchen, and the first thing I did was set my stuff down on the counter, then open the cabinets under the sink. I slid myself under the sink and started to examine the pipe, specifically looking at the P-trap and the lock nuts to make sure they weren't overly tight or loose. I noticed the man was standing directly over me, his legs spread wide so that I was sandwiched between both of his feet. It was extremely uncomfortable. I asked him politely to give me some space, and he backed up a bit, but not enough that would make me feel comfortable. I realized that I didn't see any water leaking at all, so I got out from under the sink and tried running the water, but no water came out of the faucet. I looked at the weird man and asked him why the water wasn't running. He said he must have shut off the main water valve without realizing it. When I say I stood there speechless for a few seconds, I'm not exaggerating. I asked him bluntly, "How do you do something like that by mistake?" He smiled and shrugged his shoulders. I asked him to go turn the water valve back on. He turned and said he'd be right back, and I saw him leave the kitchen, but then I heard footsteps walking upstairs. I'd never in my life heard of a water valve being upstairs in any house. I knew something was off with this guy and the situation. Everything from the condition of this house to his mannerisms. And then I started hearing multiple sets of footsteps from upstairs, coming down the steps quickly. In a split second, I decided I was out of there. I grabbed my stuff and quickly walked out to the front door and to my van. I'm a pretty large and loud dude, so I'm not really intimidated very easily by people in a physical way. But there was something about that situation and that guy that told me that some shit was about to go down. I looked at the house for a second, and then I drove away. I called Dave, my boss, letting him know it was just some kind of prank, because that just sounded better than me saying I was scared of that guy. I did a few minutes worth of investigating and found out that that was just a vacant, abandoned house. I got the number that made the call for the alleged leaky pipe from Dave, and it turned out to be a voice over IP number, not even a real number. I reported this shady encounter with the local police department just so that they would be aware of it and maybe close off that house. I've never had a reason to return to that sketchy part of town again. I only worked for that specific plumbing company for about a year. Back in 2019, I worked for Domino's. It was my first night. I was just starting out. I was only working there because I needed the money for college, supplies for my dorm, etc. And so that night I was being trained. When you're being trained, you're accompanied by the manager on your first few deliveries to see how you do and evaluate you and train you. It was late, around 8 o'clock, and we got an order. Our store wasn't electronic like they are today. We couldn't see where the locations were on a big TV. We had to go look them up on our phones for directions. We got the directions and the pizza. I still remember the order. 4 large pizzas with 2 bottles of Pib. We load them into the car, and it was my car since I was the one being evaluated. So it was me, my manager, and another trainee who I didn't know. The house we were heading towards was way out of the way in the middle of nowhere. My town was old though, so it was fairly common to go miles without anything. It took us around 15 to 20 minutes to get there. The house looked old, really old. It was an old 2-story home and it was completely run down. The wood was chipping, some of the windows had boards on them. It was not a house you'd expect people to be living in. I remember asking my manager if we had to go up there, and he told both of us yes, but that he'd come with us and hand them the pizzas and sodas. I hesitantly got out of the car and noticed that the other guy who was new was very nervous as well about walking to that front door. We finally started making our way to it when the other trainee said he thought he saw someone watching us from the furthest window from us, upstairs. Our manager told him he's just paranoid and that this shouldn't take more than a minute or two, making sure to tell us to stay calm and be nice. I don't know how I had the courage to ring the bell, but I did, which of course didn't work. So my manager pounded on the door. No answer. We waited about 15 seconds and knocked again, harder this time. Still no answer. We were all getting impatient, and there was a smell of something rotten. We couldn't tell if it was the house or if something inside had died. Finally, after about a minute of impatiently waiting, someone opens the door, but not completely. They open the door only showing part of their face and asking who we were and what we wanted. My manager said we had their pizza, and the guy quickly unlocked the door and acted all friendly towards us. It freaked the 3 of us out. It was an older gentleman, in his 50s at least. He told us it took him a while to open the door because it's hard for him to get around or some shit. Our manager handed him the receipt and asked if he was paying with cash or a check, and the man told us he'd be back with the money. He left the front door open, so I looked around to see what the house looked like inside. Empty. Completely empty. No furniture or anything in that house. Just the floor and a couple of blankets. Obviously this guy was homeless and was just living here since no one else was. That's when we heard footsteps coming from upstairs. More than one person too. That's when we got uncomfortable about the situation. The realization of what the other employees said became true. Someone was probably watching us as we walked to the front door. My manager yelled out if the man had the money yet, but he never got a response back. The footsteps stopped. Everything just stopped. It became silent. You could just hear the 3 of us breathing. My manager told us to stay at the front door in case the man came back, and that he'd go around the house to see if the man needed help or something. We nodded at him and he walked towards the back. The 2 of us heard footsteps, but not from upstairs. They were coming from below us somehow. We both looked completely puzzled and confused, and honestly uneasy about this entire situation. That's when we heard our manager scream and heard frantic running. He ran to the front of the house where both of us were and told us to go back into the car and that we're leaving. I've never driven a car faster in my life. My manager explained to us that when he was walking around to the back, he saw a group of people in the darkness surrounding a sort of makeshift campfire, but it was very small. He got closer to them and noticed in the middle was a baby deer. The group of men were sitting around laughing at it as if they found it funny. The minute he said that, my heart almost stopped. The new guy and I quit right after, and I heard the manager quit a month after this. I'd never worked a delivery job again. Obviously, we walked into some kind of cult meeting, and I'm just glad we left when we did.
Every so often when we were little, our parents would go away for a weekend while our Uncle Ron would watch us. Our Uncle Ron has been single his whole life, but he always loved kids, so he always happily did it. One Friday night, the same night our parents left town, we were all watching Titanic during a monster snowstorm. Me, my two brothers, my older sister, and our Uncle Ron. I remember certain parts of this night so vividly, but other parts I just draw blanks. I do remember, however, that the power flicked off briefly, and we had to reset the VCR to get back to where we were in the movie. Shortly after that, our Uncle Ron was fast asleep. We let him sleep while we kept watching the movie. It was at the part where Rose was running with the axe back to the room that Jack was trapped in. One of my brothers was coming back from the bathroom, and on his way, he went outside for whatever reason, likely just to look at the snow. He came back inside yelling for us to come take a look at something. Starved for a little excitement, I guess, the three of us ran to the back door. We could see what he was talking about now. There was a set of footprints in the snow. It led from the back door, then to the window, and then back in the direction of the yard and woods. To make the matter even more eerie, he said he heard the back doorknob turn. Our sister, even though she was the oldest by 3 years, ran inside freaking out. My brothers and I, on the other hand, were kind of excited by it and wanted to follow the footprints. Our sister was threatening to wake up our Uncle Ron as she saw us putting our coats and boots on, but I convinced her it'd be fine and we weren't going too far, and that we'd be together. She went back to the living room to watch the movie without us while we all marched out into the cold snowstorm, following the footprints that were quickly filling in with new snow. The footprints led to the woods in the backyard. The deeper into the woods we got, the deeper the footprints were. We weren't sure if that was because less snow was falling to the ground under the trees, or because the footprints were fresher. We were following those footprints for a while, until finally, we saw where they were leading to. A cabin, literally tucked away in the woods. It was dark inside though. No light was emitting from the windows. The footsteps led to the front door of the cabin, but we didn't dare go up to it. Instead, we crept over to the closest window to peer inside. It was too dark to see anything inside though, but we noticed it wasn't actually a glass window. It was just a screen. Then there were 2 thumps from inside of the cabin, and then the sound of something sliding. We didn't see what caused the sound though. Suddenly, one of my brothers screamed and pointed behind us. We turned to see a head poking out from another window of the cabin, but it was so dark all we could see was blackness, no features. Then the head disappeared from view as we heard rapid thumping sounds inside of the cabin, and then the front door to the cabin burst open. We all screamed and ran for our dear lives back in the direction of the house, following the footprints. I don't think we were actually chased though. The next day we tried taking our Uncle Ron on a hike to that cabin, but we couldn't for the lives of us find it. The creepiest thing to this day, we still live in the same house, and after all these years, we still never came across that cabin again. In fact, we can't even find it on maps or Google Earth. If it weren't for the fact that I was with my 2 brothers, I would question if this ever even happened. My friends, who I'll refer to as S and J, came along with me on a little camping trip near Blue Mountain National Park.
we set up camp near a small pond just because it seemed like the coolest place to chill. The point of this whole trip was mainly just to get out, drink a bunch of beers with friends, and chill. I cracked open my second Budweiser, laughing it up with S and J, talking about some of our other friends with music playing in the background, overall just having a good time. Then, however, I saw S reach over for the speaker and turn it down all the way, and then shushed us and pointed out to the pond. S whispered, "Do you guys see that?" Jay and I looked out to the pond. The campfire had a glow that partially reflected on the pond water, but even yet, I couldn't see what he was pointing at. S whispered, "There's something in the water." I went into the tent to get the flashlight from my bag. When I came out, S said don't, but I turned it on anyway and aimed it at the pond. The light didn't reveal anything or anyone, but we did all hear the sound of water being pushed, as if someone or something were walking in it. I turned out the light just because I was freaked out and looked at my two friends, who were both wearing cringing faces. I told S to shut off the speakers completely now. We all sat in our chairs, not really saying much anymore, just listening to the surroundings. About an hour passed, and within that time, nothing happened. So we grew more comfortable again, and things went back to normal. Eventually, I went to my tent, and S and J went to the tent that they'd be sharing, and we all went to sleep. Now that I was alone with my thoughts, however, I started thinking of that thing that S said was in the water. He never actually described what it looked like, if it was an animal or a person. My sense of hearing was heightened as I was in a state of alert, and because of that, I heard something from the woods. I sat up, since that always seems to help with concentration. I needed to hear one more sound before I could confirm something wasn't right. There was the sound again, much closer now, and I was able to confirm it was a foot hitting the ground. Whether it was a person's foot or an animal's foot was still unclear, however. I heard another footstep, this time much closer. It was clear someone or something was sneaking around our campsite. There was one final footstep. It was really close to the tent. I started texting S, but I was only able to type out the words, "There's something," before the gut-wrenching, blood-curdling scream pierced through the walls of the tent. I couldn't tell if it was the scream of a man or a woman. It's hard to explain, but it was deep enough where it could be a man, but not so deep to the point that it couldn't be a woman. The scream lasted about 5 seconds. Then there was silence. I didn't know if I should get out, call for my friends, or stay silent. I texted S, "Dude, we have to run." He responded, "What was that?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I tried to think of what we could do. But pretty soon, S texted me again, saying the coast is clear, run for the car. I grabbed the keys from my bag, opened the zipper to the tent, and sprinted to the car, which luckily was only about 30 seconds away. We stayed in the car all night and went back the next morning for our stuff, which luckily was all still there. Still have no idea who, or even dare I say what that thing was at our campsite that night. Just happy we got out okay. Skipping most of the background of the story, I once found myself walking through the woods during a slight drizzle. All I had on me was my backpack with a spare pair of pants, a flashlight, a tripod and camera, and some granola bars. I'm a photographer and video editor, and I was recording footage of a forest during rain, a river during rain, and snagging some pictures as well. Long story short, I found myself lost, trying to find my car. It was the worst day of my life. I was panicking, stressed, screaming to myself in anger, just wanting to find the car. I'd say an hour after getting lost, I started to pick up on noises around me. I don't mean multiple noises at once. I mean at times I'd hear the same noise, just on different sides of me. The noise was footsteps, undeniably. I was starting to panic that I was being hunted by a bear. That was only at first, though. I slowed down to quiet my own footsteps so I would more likely hear where the other footsteps were, and when I did, I turned my head as quickly as possible in that direction. I saw half a person's body jumping behind a tree. Instead of calling out something or confronting them, I did what I still think was the smart thing. I walked away fast, playing it off like I didn't see him. It was starting to get darker every minute now, and the rain was still coming down lightly, but my heart was racing faster than ever. I checked my phone every 10 seconds and finally got one bar. I stopped walking, wiped the screen of rainwater, and opened maps first thing to find the nearest road, which was very close. I let out a sigh of relief, only to hear footsteps closing in on me from behind. I turned and spotted the person again. It was a man, and I know that in of itself doesn't sound so disturbing, just really sketchy, but I'm telling you, the sight was horrifying. I could only see the man briefly before he jumped behind a tree once again as if he thought I couldn't see him, but he looked huge. Really tall, average build, maybe a little overweight, jeans, and from what I could tell, a dark blue jacket with the hood up, half zipped down, exposing a white shirt underneath. He also had on glasses, but that's all I got of his face. He was hiding behind a tree maybe 15 feet away, and over the sound of millions of raindrops, all I heard was psst, psst. Now I ran. I didn't care anymore. I was borderline about to have a panic attack. I continued running when I found the road. I ran until I thought there was no chance of him catching up to me. Then I continued walking until I finally hitched a ride from a passing car, who took me back to where I was parked. I didn't bother mentioning what happened to the driver. I just told him I got lost is all. He went on his way as I got into my car and drove the half-hour trip back home, all the while reflecting on what just happened and my life. My 10-year high school reunion was coming up. I didn't originally plan on going, but my friends convinced me. The reunion was in August on a Saturday. It was organized by a group of people from our graduating class, and it was going to be held at some catering hall in a nice area of town. It had been a long time since I'd seen any of these people, minus my handful of friends from high school who I'd be going with. I really didn't want to go because I didn't like a lot of the people from my high school, and making small talk with 100 people I hadn't seen in 10 years sounded awful. But I also felt like if all my friends went and I didn't, I'd feel like I was missing out. When the night of the reunion finally came, I drove to my friend Kayla's house, and our two other friends Marissa and Sophia came as well. We were pre-gaming at her house, then we ended up calling an Uber from there. The reunion started around 8, so we got there fashionably late at 9. We stepped into the party hall, and right away familiar faces everywhere, only older looking versions of everyone. There had to be at least 80 to 100 people here, and it was more than I was expecting. Being with my friends made it easier to say hi to people I hadn't seen in forever. The vibe honestly was a bit different than I was expecting. There was a DJ, party lights, and a generally loud atmosphere, whereas what I was expecting was a quiet, intimate setting focused heavily on talking. People were getting really drunk at this, including my friends. We sat at a table with some other girls from high school. It was about 10 of us at the table. As the night progressed and everyone mingled and caught up with different people, I found myself feeling a bit awkward as my friends were doing their own things. I was alone at the table eating, and I noticed a guy who I didn't recognize at another table, looking in my direction. When we locked eyes, I looked away, but I wondered who he was. I glanced back for just a second and noticed he was still looking at me. Next thing I knew, he was coming over to sit next to me. He told me his name was Connor, and he started hitting on me immediately, saying he saw me across the room and couldn't help but come over and say hi. He was honestly decent looking, and I felt awkward sitting alone anyway, so I really didn't mind him sitting there. I said, "I don't recognize you. Did you go to our school?" He said, "Yeah, everyone's been saying that. I transferred to your guys' school our senior year. I didn't meet a lot of you." I basically said, "Oh, that's interesting. Who do you actually know here?" He replied that he's just friends with a couple guys who are also here. I asked their names, and he gave first names only. I guessed the last names, and he said yes to both as he laughed. We talked for a while until he asked for my number so that he could go back to his friends. I gave it to him and walked away. Overall impression was that he seemed normal and I enjoyed talking to him. Now I was left alone again, so after finishing my food and drink, I went to find my friends. They were all separated, talking with different people, some people who I wasn't the biggest fan of. I went over to Kayla, who was mid-conversation with a few people, and I joined the conversation. My friends were all wasted. I was definitely drunk, but not on their level. I kind of wanted to just go home. It almost felt like a saving grace when Connor texted me asking me if I needed a ride home since he's leaving. I texted him back, "Yes, please." He told me to meet him in the lobby of the building. So I looked around and then decided to just do an Irish exit. Too many people to say goodbye to. I saw Connor in the lobby by the front door. We walked to his car. It was a black two-door coupe. I honestly don't know what it was. I'm not a car person. He asked me to put my address into his phone. I thanked him for doing this as we started to drive. He pulled a couple water bottles from the back seat and handed me one, and he suggested I drink a lot of water to avoid a hangover tomorrow. So I started to sip some water. Suddenly my phone started blowing up. Kayla was calling me, and Marissa and Sophia were also texting me in our group chat. I didn't pick up the call, but I read their texts. They were asking where I went, and I told them I got a ride home. They kept pressing me, asking with who, and Kayla said check the Facebook group that organized the reunion. Then Marissa sent a screenshot of a post made by a girl in the Facebook group, warning everyone of a random guy who wasn't from our school going around talking to girls, introducing himself as a different name to everyone. Kayla tried calling me. I pressed decline and texted her I'm with this guy named Connor. She replied in all caps that someone said that she saw me leave with that guy. I wanted to actually vomit now. I looked at the guy, and then I evaluated the situation. I had to run when I had the chance. The next time we were stopped at a red light, I opened the door and said I gotta go and ran as fast as I could. I ran into this parking lot of a TGI Fridays. He didn't chase after me, he just kept driving. I called Kayla back right then and there, and she told me to wait here. They'd all Uber over here and pick me up. I waited in this parking lot for like 15 to 20 minutes until they arrived. By this point, I started feeling extremely drunk, lightheaded, and a foggy memory. I believe he had put something in that water bottle to try and sedate me. Thankfully, I didn't drink that much. The worst part about this was that the guy now had my apartment address. We all slept at Kayla's house that night. The next morning, I drove home, but shortly after entering my apartment, there was a knock at my door. I freaked out thinking it was that guy, but I saw it was my neighbor through the window. I opened the door, and my neighbor asked me if I knew the guy who came to my apartment last night and was looking through the windows. I told him all about last night. He was appalled too. He said when he confronted the guy asked him if this was where Miranda lives. My neighbor was wise enough to say, "No, you have the wrong apartment." My neighbor doing this just may have saved me from that guy ever coming back. When my lease was up, I moved to a different apartment in the same community, just to be safe. I'm super grateful my friends all tried to warn me in time before it was too late. My high school does 5 and 10-year reunions. My 5-year reunion was a few years ago. My high school was on the smaller side with around 200 kids per grade, so just about everyone knew everyone, even if just partially. For the 5-year reunion, it was being held in a small banquet hall in town. I was excited to go see all my old friends who I hadn't seen in forever. Of course, arriving to these things alone can be a bit scary, so my friend Julia and I were going to go together. Julia has been my best friend ever since middle school. She knows about everything that I've been through, and I know about everything that she's been through. That includes the situation I had with a boy named Tyler. Tyler was a boy who I had a little bit of history with, meaning we hooked up a few times senior year. But he quickly started giving me crazy and obsessive vibes, and when I cut him off, he threatened me and got aggressive. He sent me threatening texts, like he knows where I live and he knows when my parents aren't home and more. One night he came to my parents' house and threw rocks at my window, and my dad had to go outside and chase him away. As time passed, I guess he lost interest in harassing me. Tyler was friends with some of the, I guess you'd say, weirder kids in high school. Not the athletes, not the cool kids, not the gothy kids, just the slightly weird group. When word got out that he'd been harassing me, a lot of people grew to hate him. I just hoped he wasn't going to be at the reunion. Julia and I got to the venue it was being hosted at and did our rounds, saying hi to a bunch of people. There was a solid 50 people there at the peak of the night, which was a solid turnout considering the small size of our grade to begin with. At some point in the night, though, I got a tap on the shoulder from none other than Tyler. When I turned to see him, I felt my heart sink. He said, "Hey, can we talk?" It had been years since I'd spoken to him, and that was the first thing he said to me. I said something along the lines of, "Hey, I hope you're good, but there's nothing to talk about," and I tried to walk away. He grabbed my shoulder and spun me around and said, "You're already going to be like that?" I pushed his hand off of me and said, "Let go of me." He looked around nervously and said, all right, and walked away. I could tell he didn't want the negative attention. This now ruined the mood of the night for me, as I had to try my hardest to avoid looking at or going anywhere near Tyler. I noticed he was with one of the kids I remember him hanging around in high school. I got into a conversation with Julia and a few other girls about the situation with Tyler, and how he just grabbed me moments ago. Everyone was on my side and agreed he'd always been a weirdo creep and was known for being aggressive with girls. Oddly enough, I didn't really see him again after I saw him with his friend. I assumed he left early, which was a major relief for me. Julia and I stayed for a few more hours. Then we left with a few other girls to go to a dive bar nearby. And then, after another hour or so, Julia dropped me off at home. As I walked up to my front door, I noticed another car pass by Julia's car and continue driving down the street. Considering the hour and how quiet the street is, that was concerning. It was a Jeep Cherokee. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe I was rightfully curious, but the next day I looked up Tyler's Instagram. He was private. I requested to follow him with my fake account, which, yes, I have for situations like this. He accepted my follow request, but I couldn't see any pictures of a Jeep, or any car for that matter. This made me feel slightly more at ease. I live alone, so my worst fear was Tyler finding my new address and coming to my house at night. The next day, Tyler DM'd me on Instagram a long message, trying to manipulate me into seeing him. All these years later, he was still giving me obsessive, creepy vibes. I blocked his Instagram, but I never could have imagined what that would have led to next. The same night I blocked him, I woke up to my doorbell ringing at 1 a.m., repeatedly. I was so scared. It had to be Tyler, I just knew it. I didn't know what to do. I didn't exactly have my dad here to chase him away like all those years ago. My parents live in Florida now. The doorbell ringing turned to angry-sounding pounds on the door, booming through the apartment. This pounding went on for some time, and then the doorbell again, over and over and over. I finally went to the door, and it stopped. I peeked out the window at the top of the door, and nobody was outside. I slept with one eye open that night. And then the next day, my friend's dad helped me out and contacted his detective friend in our hometown. He came by the house and took pictures of the texts, from years ago and the long DM from just a few nights before. He then contacted Tyler and gave him a verbal warning to cease all contact, or this would be considered stalking and harassment. So far it's worked. It makes me wish we went to the police all those years ago. Some people are dangerous and simply don't change. I hope he's not at the 10-year reunion. I was seeing this girl for a few weeks. We'd been on 2 dates. Her name was Phoebe. We matched on a dating app and eventually met a few days later. She was 4 years older than me. Our first date was drinks, and our second date we went out with my friends on a weekend. My friends had neutral opinions about her. They thought she was, quote, nice and kinda quiet. They'd later reveal their actual thoughts on her, but I'll get to that later. Phoebe invited me to an upcoming high school reunion party. She told me she didn't want to go alone, and honestly, after she came to hang out with my friends and I felt like I owed her. This reunion party was falling on a random Saturday in the fall. It wasn't organized by her school, though. She told me that it was organized by this rich guy from her class, and it was being hosted at his house. I haven't had my high school reunion yet, but as far as I know, these things are usually held at bars or catering halls. We got to this guy's house, and it was admittedly a fancy-looking house. It had a gated driveway, but no fancy cars parked anywhere in sight. My thought was maybe the owner parked his car in the garage during the party. The second we stepped into the house, I felt like everyone was staring at us. More specifically, me. A few people came up to Phoebe and hugged her hello, then shifted their attention to me. I felt almost like I was being interrogated with some of the questions these people were asking me. Like my whole life story, what I do for a living, who I live with. Finally, Phoebe pulled us away, only to go talk to more people who I also felt like were asking really personal and weird questions. There was also something about all the people in here. They seemed to be older looking than 28, which was the age Phoebe told me she was. Some of these people looked well into their 30s. I made a comment on that to Phoebe, and she said, yeah, some of these people aren't aging too well. I asked if she remembers all these people, and she said yes. I then asked who the party host was. I was curious to meet the owner of this big house. She said she hadn't seen him yet. Throughout the entirety of me being there, I felt like everybody was shooting me daggers. They wouldn't look away either. I whispered that to Phoebe, and she said back it's probably because they're wondering who I am. At the time, that was the only logical explanation I could think of too. It's hard to explain the growing awkwardness at this party, but I can assure you, this was not what a normal high school reunion would be like. There was no music, and everyone was dressed weirdly, not like normal 28-year-olds. But that's the other thing. None of these people looked like they were in their 20s. I was getting uncomfortable with some of the stares I was getting in the room we were in, so I told Phoebe I'm going to run to the bathroom. Realistically, I just wanted to get out of that room and explore the house a little bit. I didn't have a drink in my hand or anything to make me feel at ease. I was just walking around this giant house empty-handed, and anyone I passed stared at me. To say I felt out of place would be the understatement of the century. I found the bathroom. I stepped inside even though I didn't have to go. I locked myself inside just to sit and regather myself, take a break from the awkwardness outside. I texted all my friends about how weird this reunion was, and wondering how I could convince Phoebe to leave early. We'd already been there about 30 to 45 minutes, and this unnamed mystery party host was nowhere to be seen. Phoebe texted me, "Where are you?" I replied, "In the bathroom, give me a minute." Then I followed that up with, "This party's really weird, I'm down to leave soon." She said, "Why?" I said, "Everyone's being weird." Then someone knocked on the bathroom door, so I couldn't sit in there anymore. I washed my hands quick and left the bathroom, and the guy waiting outside, who looked like one of the younger ones here, said in a very low voice to me, "You should leave. That girl isn't who she says she is." I froze for a second, then said, "Phoebe?" He said, "Whatever she told you her name is." He then asked what she told me this party was. I said that she told me it was a high school reunion. The guy then smirked and said, "Do these people look like they're going to a high school reunion?" He left it off with, and I quote, "Trust me, leave sooner than later." And then he walked into the bathroom and shut the door. I almost knocked on the door to get him to come out and further explain, but I thought for a second. I was already suspicious and uncomfortable in this house. That guy just confirmed something weird is going on here. I walked straight to the front door without drawing attention to myself. I still felt people staring at me as I walked to the door. I walked straight from my car in the street and drove home. Phoebe texted me asking where I went. I didn't answer. When I got home, I looked up her number on White Pages. That number was not associated with the name Phoebe. The name that came up was Claire Foster. The address that I picked her up at both times is also different than the address that came up on White Pages, which made me realize I never saw her leave the house. She was already waiting on the sidewalk both times. I replied to her text, "I had to leave, I'm sorry," and blocked her number. My friends all made jokes, and they told me she thought she was weird and off from the start, but they didn't want to tell me that and make me feel bad. My one friend joked that it sounded like I was in the movie Get Out. My friends and family all have had little theories as to what was going on. Some people would even think I exaggerated the whole thing until I told them about the fake name the girl gave me, and the guy telling me to leave sooner than later. It was 2022.
I was living in the Bay Area at the time, Oakland specifically, and I'd driven up to visit my parents in Eureka for the weekend. If you've never driven Highway 101 along the Northern California coast, it's beautiful during the day and kind of a nightmare at night. Like long stretches with no other cars, no cell service, barely any lights, kind of ominous really. I left my parents' place around 8 p.m. on a Sunday, which was stupid in hindsight. I should have just stayed the night and driven back Monday morning. But I had an early shift and figured I'd rather just knock out the drive. Famous last words, I guess. The first couple hours were fine. The stretch I was on had narrowed down to a 2-lane road at that point. That's how most of rural 101 is once you get north of the bay. It was somewhere around Trinidad when the fog started rolling in. Fog on that part of the coast isn't unusual, but this was different. Within maybe 5 minutes, it went from clear visibility to barely being able to see 20 feet ahead of my car. It was actually really bad, worse than I'm describing. I slowed down to maybe 35 and kept going. The smart thing would have been to pull off and wait it out, but there's really not a lot of places to stop on that stretch. And honestly, I just wanted to get home. I figured if I took it slow, I'd be fine. Here's the thing about fog that thick though, and any California driver knows this, but it messes with your sense of space. You can't see landmarks, you can't tell how far you've gone, you can't see what's coming up ahead. It's disorienting as hell, especially when you're already tired. After another half hour or so of driving, I saw a figure standing off the side of the road. I say figure because that's genuinely what it looked like at first. Just a shape on the shoulder, maybe 50 feet ahead. As I got closer, I could see it was a person, a guy based on how tall it was, and he was just standing there facing the road. He wasn't walking or waving me down like he needed a lift, and it didn't look like he was on the phone either. He was genuinely just standing there. I slowed down even more as I passed because I was worried about clipping him if he stepped out into the road. He didn't move though. He didn't even turn his head to watch my car go by, which was really creepy. I got a good look at him as I passed, and there was nothing about his face that struck me as particularly unusual. My first thought was maybe his car broke down somewhere and he was waiting for a ride, which would make sense, right? Except I hadn't passed any cars on the shoulder, and there was no reason for him to be standing in that exact spot facing that exact direction. There was nothing there. I thought about turning around to ask if he needed help, but something about the whole thing felt wrong. It wasn't my problem, so I just kept driving. About 10 minutes later though, I saw him again. I'm not exaggerating, it was the same guy. Same build, same dark clothes, same stance on the shoulder. The only difference was that this time he was on the left side instead of the right, but everything else was identical. I actually said what the hell audibly out loud to myself, because there was no way this guy could have gotten ahead of me. I was the only car on the road, and there weren't any cross streets or shortcuts or anything like that. The only explanation was that it was a different person who just happened to look exactly like the first guy and was standing in exactly the same weird way. I didn't want to look at him as I passed, but I couldn't help myself. I had to confirm whether it was the same guy, and after getting a good look, I was dead certain it was. But this time, the guy actually locked eyes with me as I passed, and I couldn't look away fast enough. Seeing his head snap to my eyes was really freaky, and I instantly regretted making eye contact. I sped up a little, not a lot, because the fog was still thick and I wasn't trying to drive off the road, but I sped up enough that I was pushing 45. I wanted distance between me and whatever the hell was going on back there. The fog got even worse after that though. I could barely see the center line at that point, so I really had no choice but to slow back down. I was having trouble thinking straight, which I attributed to the mixed effect of how tired I was, how hard it was to drive, and what I had just seen. I kept trying to rationalize it, but I couldn't. My train of thought was interrupted though, because not 3 minutes later, my headlights exposed something ahead. There was another person up there, only this time he was standing in the middle of the road. I had no choice but to stop, which is exactly what I did. This time he was wearing a hood that was covering his face, so I couldn't see what exactly he looked like, but I had a feeling it was the same guy. He once again didn't move, which is when I started really getting scared. We were at a standstill, and even though I couldn't see his face, I could feel him looking at me. I didn't know what to do. I flashed my brights at him a few times, trying to get him to move out of the way or at the very least react, but he didn't. I put the car in reverse, and when I looked in my rearview mirror,
I nearly died. There was someone behind me. There was a person back there creeping towards my car. I yelled holy shit and put the car back in drive. I was boxed in, but I didn't care. There was an actual threat on my life now. I pulled hard to the right, crossing into the opposite lane to get around the guy blocking the road ahead. The guy didn't move, and I thought I was in the clear. But then something hit my car from behind. It wasn't just a light tap. It was violent. The whole back end of my car jolted to the right, and I heard this awful crunching sound, like metal on metal. I maintained control of the car and kept driving, thinking I had gotten into an accident with another car. But when I checked my mirrors, there was nothing behind me. Nothing at all, not even those people. As if the situation wasn't already freaky enough, that made it so much worse. I wasn't waiting though. I sped off as fast as I was comfortable going with how heavy the fog was. By the time I hit the 101 interchange, I could actually see again, and for the first time, I felt my brain starting to relax. But the more I calmed down, the more I thought about what had happened. And this might sound surprising, but I genuinely concluded that I hallucinated everything. Here's the thing, I had been driving for almost 4 hours at that point. I was exhausted. I had been staring into fog for God knows how long, barely able to see anything, completely alone on a dark highway. So an extremely vivid hallucination didn't seem that far-fetched to me. Why it was so oddly specific was beyond me, but there was no other explanation for me having seen those people or having felt a wreck that didn't actually happen. By the time I made it home, I was just ready to sleep the whole thing off and try to forget about it. But then I walked around to the back of my car. The rear bumper was destroyed. There was a massive dent running almost the entire width of it, which meant whatever hit me had hit me way harder than I thought. It also meant that I actually had been hit, meaning I hadn't hallucinated anything. I stared at the dent for like 5 minutes. There wasn't any paint transfer, which there definitely would have been if I had been hit by another car. But if it wasn't another car that had hit me, I had no idea what could have caused such considerable damage. I did end up calling the cops to report what I saw, but it was more so just to get the info out there. I've thought about that night a lot over the past 4 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. What I've accepted is that I hallucinated the figures, and in my panicked attempt to drive off, I hit a guardrail post or a mile marker or something like that. The thing that gets me is this though. I can accept a hallucination, but for me to hallucinate one thing, the figures, while actually experiencing the other, the crash, is something I have trouble accepting. The fact that there was actually damage to my car has always made me think there was something more malicious going on that night. This happened this past spring break, so we're talking only a few weeks ago. I'm still in college, I'm a senior now, and I went back to my hometown for the week like I always do. The problem with going home, though, is that there's genuinely nothing to do there. I grew up in one of those suburban towns that's technically close to a city, but doesn't have any of the benefits of actually being in one, meaning no bars or nightlife or anything really within walking distance. When I'm at school, I've always got something going on, but back at home, it's a ghost town. The other issue is that none of my hometown friends had the same spring break schedule as me. I've got maybe 4 or 5 people I still keep in touch with from high school, and every single one of them was either still in class or already had their spring break earlier in March, so I was looking at a full week of doing nothing, which I really wasn't thrilled about. I should probably also mention that I've been trying to cut back on some stuff lately, nicotine and alcohol mainly. I figured a week at home with nothing to do was either going to make that worse or give me a chance to reset. I decided I was going to work out every single day instead. I was going to lift in the mornings and run in the afternoons, keep myself busy just so I could stay out of my own head. That's how I ended up going for a run on a random Tuesday afternoon. I remembered this loop I used to do back when I ran cross country in high school. It's exactly 3 miles from start to finish, starting and ending at my house. The route takes me through my neighborhood for maybe a quarter mile, then cuts into this wooded trail that winds through a small patch of forest before spitting you back out onto the street about a block from home. I've probably run that loop 1,000 times between freshman and senior year. The woods is the best part, honestly. Running on pavement destroys your knees, but the trail through the woods is soft. It's quiet in there too, which is something I always look for on my runs. So I headed out around 5. The sun wasn't going to set for another couple hours, so I wasn't worried about visibility. What I did notice though, and I noticed it the second I stepped outside, was the fog. I don't know how to describe it other than to say it was thick in a way I'd never seen before. I've lived in that town my whole life, and I don't remember fog like that. It looked fake almost, like I was in some ambient video game or one of those lo-fi YouTube videos with the anime girl studying. Everything past maybe 30 or 40 feet just dissolved into haze. I thought about skipping the run, but I talked myself out of it. The trail through the woods is a straight shot, one path with no forks or diverging paths. I've been through there so many times I could probably do it blindfolded. Getting lost wasn't even a possibility. I had my Garmin watch on so I could track my pace and distance. I started my workout, did the quarter-mile through the neighborhood, and entered the woods. The fog was even thicker in there, which made sense since the trees blocked out a lot of the remaining daylight. I couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet ahead of me, but the trail is easy to follow. For the first mile and a half, everything was normal. I was running a little slower than usual because of the visibility, but it wasn't too bad. I remember checking my watch around the mile mark, then again at a mile and a half. The issue started around the 2.5 mile mark. At that point in the loop, I should have been approaching the end of the trail. The path curves to the left, you go up a small hill, and then you're out, back on pavement. I know that section by heart. Hell, I know every section by heart. I've literally run that loop hundreds of times. But when I looked down at my watch and saw 2.5 miles, I was still deep in the woods. I figured my watch was just being weird. It was at least 4 years old at that point, so I assumed its GPS signal was getting interrupted by the dense tree coverage or something. The fog could have been messing with it too. These seemed like reasonable enough explanations though, so I just kept running, assuming I wasn't as far along the trail as I thought. But then I passed 3 miles, which was when I knew something was up. 3 miles is the entire loop. At 3 miles, I should have been standing either in my driveway or on the street. Instead, I was still surrounded by trees on both sides, still running on the same dirt path with no indication that I was anywhere close to getting out. So I stopped. I'm not a paranoid person, and I'm not superstitious either. There must have been some rational explanation for what was going on. I caught my breath and tried to think, but I genuinely could not figure out what was going on. There was only one trail, which I knew for a fact. There weren't any forks, branches, or alternate paths. The only way I could have gotten lost in there was if I had physically left the path and waded through the brush and undergrowth, which I definitely hadn't done. I checked my watch again. 3.1 miles. The number kept ticking up even though I was standing still, which told me the GPS was definitely having issues. That was the only part of the whole thing that made any sense. I didn't really have a choice at that point. I could either keep running forward and hope I eventually hit the exit, or I could turn around and retrace my steps. The second option seemed smarter. If I just ran back the way I came, I'd eventually get to the trailhead where I started, and from there, I knew exactly how to get home. So that's what I did. I turned around and started running back. The fog had gotten worse. I didn't know how that was even possible, but it had. I had to slow my pace just to make sure I didn't run off the trail by accident. After about a mile of running, so about 4 total miles at that point, I heard something. Like I said earlier, it's usually dead quiet in the woods, which I suspect is the case because it's too small for a lot of animals to inhabit. So hearing a sound out there was something my brain wasn't prepared for, but the sound itself was so much worse. It was something I'd never heard before. The closest I can get to describing it is a moan, but that's not quite right. It was lower than a moan, more like a drone, and it fluctuated. It would swell up, then dip back down, then swell up again. Almost like a siren, but human. I can't overstate how wrong it sounded. It wasn't someone calling for help, and it didn't really sound like someone in pain either. It was just a sustained, wavering noise that didn't seem to have any purpose. I started running faster, but you have to remember that I had been running for over 4 miles at that point. I could only go so fast, and the exhaustion only made the situation that much more terrifying. Running faster only tired me out more, and the more tired I got, the more scared I got. The sound didn't stop no matter how fast I ran. Whoever or whatever was out there was matching my speed. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, and I did multiple times, I couldn't see anything. There was just fog back there. I ran with the sound following me for what felt like forever. I had no other choice. It was the scariest moment of my life. After an eternity of running, I finally made it out of the woods. I ran into the street and nearly threw up out of exhaustion. The fog was still impossibly thick, even outside the woods. I turned around and looked back into the woods. To my horror, there was something standing right in the middle of the trail. Just a little ways beyond the trailhead. I say something because I don't know what else to call it. It was just a shape, this dark mass of a silhouette. It was way taller than me, and I'm 6'1". This thing had to be 7 feet tall at least. It wasn't moving closer or further away from me. It just watched me. I could feel it. If it weren't for the fact that it was gently swaying back and forth, I would have questioned whether I was looking at a tree or something. The droning sound had stopped, but I wasn't giving it another thought. I turned and ran home without looking back. That was a few weeks ago now. I'm back at school at this point, but I haven't been able to think about that night. I can't get that image of what I saw in the fog out of my head. That black mass and that god-awful sound. I told my parents about what I saw, obviously, and they both seemed convinced that it was just a tall person trying to scare me, or potentially attack me, which I guess is possible, but I don't believe that. How were they able to make that noise while running to keep up with me? Impossible. And how tall they were, too. I don't know what was in those woods that night, and I probably never will. This happened about 6 years ago, late September. My buddy Edwin and I had been talking about kayaking Willapa Bay for probably 2 years at that point, and we finally locked in a weekend to actually do it. If you're not familiar with the area, Willapa Bay is this massive tidal estuary on the Washington coast, something like 25 miles long. It's mostly oyster farms and wildlife refuge, and on a clear day, it's honestly one of the most peaceful places I've ever been. The weekend we picked was not a clear day. Neither of us were amateurs. We'd both been kayaking since we were kids, and Edwin actually worked as a guide for a few summers during college. We knew what we were doing. That's important context for what I'm about to tell you, because I don't want anyone thinking we were just a couple of idiots who got spooked because we didn't know how hot water and fog work. We launched early Saturday morning from a put-in spot near Nakota. The fog was really thick, but we figured it would burn off by mid-morning like it usually does on the coast. We had a GPS, a compass, and everything. The plan was to paddle out toward Long Island, maybe do some bird watching, have lunch on one of the sandbars, and head back before the afternoon tide shift. The first hour or so was fine. The fog muffled everything in that way coastal fog does. You feel like you're paddling through cotton and everything is really quiet. We couldn't see more than maybe 40 feet in any direction, but we were staying close together and checking our bearing every few minutes. No big deal. It was probably around 9 a.m. when I first heard something. It was a splashing sound. At first, I thought it was Edwin. We were paddling in loose tandem formation, him about 15 feet to my left, and I figured he just adjusted his stroke or something. But when I glanced over, his paddle was resting across his kayak. He asked if I heard that too, and I nodded my head yes. We both stopped paddling and just drifted there for a second, listening. It was the sound of oars, not paddles, which I say specifically because oars and paddles make distinct sounds. We were using paddles. You'd only use oars if you were on a different kind of boat, but it was definitely someone rowing a boat, and it didn't sound too far away from us either. Maybe 100 feet somewhere off to the right. Edwin said it was probably just someone else out there on the water, which seemed reasonable enough. There were other kayakers who used the bay, and occasionally you'd see fishermen in small boats checking crab pots. The fog was thick enough that we couldn't see them, but sound travels strangely over water, especially in fog. Sometimes things sound closer than they are, sometimes they sound further. We waited for a minute, expecting whoever it was to either call out or appear through the haze. Standard etiquette when visibility is low is to announce yourself and let other boaters know where you are. But the rowing just continued at the same steady pace. I suggested maybe they didn't know we were there, so Edwin said hello into the nothingness. But there was no response. In fact, whoever was in the other boat didn't even seem to notice, because the rowing sounds didn't speed up, slow down, or change at all. We started paddling again, figuring we'd either come across them or they'd pass by. But here's the thing, And I know this sounds paranoid, but over the next 20 minutes, that rowing sound never got any closer or further away. Hearing that same exact rhythm over and over again started getting intoxicating, and after a while, I was actually in awe of how perfectly someone could keep their stride for so long. But as time went past, I only got more and more freaked out. It was an unsettling situation, to say the least. Edwin and I really weren't talking much anymore, but I knew he felt the same way. At one point, we shifted our course slightly east, trying to angle toward the shore, and for a split second, the fog thinned out just enough for me to see a small rowboat sitting in the water. I could see the shape of someone at the oars, so I knew there was a person in it. But then the fog closed back in, and they were out of sight again. The whole glimpse lasted maybe 3 seconds. I asked Edwin if he'd seen it, and he said yes. At that point, I wanted to leave. Something about the whole situation was making me deeply uncomfortable, and I couldn't even fully articulate why. It's not like we'd seen anything threatening. It was just some guy rowing a boat, but the way he refused to identify himself or even acknowledge our presence, and the way he seemed to be following us, was just so creepy. I started heading for the shore, hoping Edwin would follow my lead, and he did. The problem was the fog. Even with the GPS, navigating the bay in low visibility isn't straightforward. There's sandbars that shift with the tides, shallow channels you can get stuck in, all sorts of nasty stuff. We knew roughly where we were, but roughly isn't the same as exactly, and the last thing we wanted was to beach ourselves on a mudflat while that other boat was still out there somewhere. We paddled southeast, moving as quickly as we could without exhausting ourselves. The rowing sound stayed with us the whole time. I kept glancing to my right, hoping to catch another glimpse through the fog, but I never did. And then, without any warning, the fog started to lift. It didn't clear completely, but it thinned enough that we could suddenly see maybe 100 yards in any direction. I immediately looked to my right, toward where the rowing sound had been coming from. There was nothing there. It was just open water. I looked behind us. Open water there too. I looked in every direction I could. I saw Edwin doing the same thing, but as far as we could tell, the bay was empty. I looked at Edwin and realized however freaked out I was, he was even more scared. I could see it in his eyes. We kept paddling, and even though the rowing sound had stopped and we could actually see now, the situation was a lot scarier. How could that boat have just disappeared like that? The shore came into view about 5 minutes later, and I was relieved. I thought the ordeal was finally over, but no. We paddled straight for land, not even bothering to look for a suitable landing spot. We hit the shallows, and I jumped out into knee-deep water. The water was cold as hell, but I barely noticed. I was just glad to be on solid ground again. For a minute or two, neither of us said anything. We just stood there on the beach catching our breath, looking out to the bay. The fog was still lifting, which was good, but there were still no boats anywhere out there. Edwin had wandered a little ways up the beach while I was securing my kayak. He told me to follow him, so I did. I realized he was looking at something, and I hurried to catch up to him, but the moment I noticed what he was looking at, I was terrified all over again. There were footsteps, wet, barefoot footsteps leading out of the water and up onto the sand. They were fresh, which was painfully obvious because you could see where water was still pooled in the depressions. Whoever made them had not been out of the water for long. But here's the thing. They didn't just lead up to the beach and stop. The prints came out of the water, walked a few feet up toward the tree line, and then turned and followed the shoreline to our left before eventually cutting back toward the trees and disappearing into the woods. I followed the path with my eyes, trying to trace it backward. The prints were coming from somewhere further down the shore. Whoever made them had seemingly walked up along the water's edge, come up onto the beach right where we'd landed, and then headed into the forest. Edwin was a few steps ahead of me. He said he wanted to leave, but I couldn't stop looking at the footprints. They were leading somewhere, or rather, they were coming from somewhere, and I wanted to know where. I told Edwin I wanted to follow them back, not into the trees, but the other direction. I wanted to see where they originated. He looked at me like I was out of my mind, which honestly, maybe I was, but something about this whole situation had been gnawing at me since we first heard those oars, and I wasn't ready to just paddle away without at least trying to understand what the hell was going on. Edwin didn't want to come back with me, but he also didn't want to stand there alone, so after about 30 seconds of back and forth, he reluctantly agreed. We started following those footprints down the shoreline. The fog still hadn't completely lifted, but the visibility was a lot better at that point. We walked for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, keeping the footprints to our left, and then I saw it. Maybe 50 yards down the beach, pulled up onto the sand at an angle, was a small wooden rowboat. The wood was dark, almost black, and the oars were resting inside it. It was the same boat, I was 100% certain of it. The shape, the color, the size, it was the exact same boat I'd seen through the fog when we were out on the water, and now it was here, on the shore, with a trail of wet footprints leading away from it. I started walking toward it instinctively, but Edwin grabbed my arm. He told me we were leaving, and he said he wasn't asking this time. He said he didn't care what was in the boat or who had been rowing it. We were done. Something about the way he said it took me from curious to downright terrified. Whoever had been in that boat had somehow gotten to shore before us, walked all the way down the beach to the exact spot where we had just happened to land, and then still had time to disappear into the trees. We turned around and started heading back toward the kayaks. Edwin was practically sprinting at that point, and seeing him run only freaked me out even more. We got to our kayaks, shoved them back into the water, and paddled out of there as fast as we could. And that was that. I've thought about that morning a lot over the past 6 years. I've gone through every possible explanation I could think of. The best case scenario is that we were just victims of some elaborate prank, but I think that's somewhat far-fetched. Here's what I keep coming back to. We were on the water for over 2 hours. We paddled in multiple directions, changed course several times, and eventually made a beeline for shore when the fog started lifting. Whoever was in that rowboat would have had to get to land before us, in a slower vessel no less, walk all the way down the shoreline to the exact spot where we ended up landing, and then disappear into the trees. All before we even hit the beach. It sounds so absurd and impossible that I honestly don't know what to think. So that's why after I send this, I'm gonna try not to think about it once again. I was 15 when it happened. It was a Friday night in late September, just starting to get cold where I lived. My parents went out to dinner with some family friends, and they said they would not be home until late. I had the house to myself. I invited over my neighbor and best friend Chris. He was the same age as me and lived across the street. We usually hung out in my basement and played games or watched movies, but that night we got bored. At some point, he brought up playing hide and seek. It sounded dumb at first, but we had done it before with a group, and it had been fun. The house was small, but it had a lot of places to hide, especially in the dark. We turned off most of the lights to make it scarier. The only light on was in the kitchen. The rules were simple. No going outside, no going into the attic or the crawl space. Basement, bedrooms, closets, and under furniture were all fair game. Chris wanted to hide first, so I covered my eyes in the living room and counted to 50. I could hear him running at first, and then silence. I finished counting and announced that I was coming. I started in the kitchen since it was right there, but there was nowhere good to hide. I checked behind the basement door, then down the hall. I looked in the bathroom. Empty. I opened the closet near the front door. Nothing. I went upstairs. The floor creaked under me, and every little sound made me tense. I checked my parents' bedroom first, looking under the bed and behind the dresser. Nobody. I went down the hall into my room. It was messy, but not enough for Chris to hide well. I still checked the closet and under the desk. Nothing. That left the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open. I pushed it slowly, expecting him to jump out and scare me, but the room was dark and quiet. I stepped inside and scanned around. I bent down to look under the bed. Nothing. I opened the closet door. Empty. At that point, I thought maybe he was in the basement, so I went back downstairs. I checked behind the laundry machines and in the storage space under the stairs. I was about to give up when I finally found him curled up behind some boxes. He laughed and asked how long it had taken me. I told him way too long. Then we switched. He counted and I hid. I went upstairs and slid under the guest bed, pulling the bed skirt down to cover me. My heart raced while I lay there in the dark. I heard him come upstairs a few minutes later, his footsteps slow and heavy on the floor. He opened the bathroom door first, then he stepped into my parents' room. After a while, the footsteps came down the hall toward where I was. I could hear him breathing as he walked into the guest room. He stopped near the bed. I held my breath. His shoes shuffled against the carpet. Then silence, a long silence. I thought he had figured it out and was about to yank up the bed skirt, but instead, he walked out. I lay there a few more minutes, waiting to hear him call that I had won, but the house stayed too quiet. Finally, I crawled out. I went downstairs expecting to find him on the couch, but he wasn't there. I called out that the game was over. A voice came from the basement saying he was down there. I thought he was messing with me. I walked to the basement door, opened it, and shouted down the stairs. He shouted back that he was still looking for me, and he asked where I was hiding. That made my stomach twist. I told him I was out now and standing in the kitchen. A second later, I heard him coming up the stairs. He stepped into the light and looked confused. He asked how I had gotten upstairs so fast. I told him I had been under the guest bed the whole time. He frowned and said he could have sworn he checked that room, and he heard someone moving inside. He said he thought he heard breathing. I told him I stayed perfectly still. We argued a little, but then we just shrugged it off. We played another round, but the whole time I felt uneasy. Every creak in the house made me jump. At one point while I was counting, I thought I heard something upstairs, like a soft thud, but when I searched, it was empty. I found Chris in the laundry room. We kept playing until we both got tired. Then we sat on the couch in the living room and turned the TV back on. That's when we both froze. From upstairs came a loud bump, like something heavy falling. Chris asked if it was my parents. I reminded him they were still gone. The hair on my arm stood up. We sat there waiting, but the house went silent again. Chris said maybe something slid off a shelf. I wanted to believe that, but then, while we sat listening, we both heard it clearly. A slow creak of floorboards, the sound of someone walking down the hall upstairs. We stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then I whispered that maybe we should check. Chris shook his head, saying no way, but if someone had broken in, we couldn't just sit there. I told him to stay behind me and grab the fireplace poker from beside the couch. We went to the stairs and started creeping up. The house was so quiet I could hear my own breathing. The steps groaned under our weight. When we reached the top, I pointed toward the guest room. The door was closed now. I knew for a fact I had left it cracked open. We stood there frozen. Then from behind the door came a sound, a slow dragging noise, like fabric sliding across the carpet. Chris whispered that we should leave. I wanted to, but curiosity and fear kept me in place. I raised the poker and reached for the knob. When I tell you my hands were shaking, I'm not just saying that to be dramatic for the story. I pushed the door open fast. The room was dark, but the shape of the bed and the dresser were visible. Nobody was there. The closet door stood half open. I moved closer as Chris stayed in the doorway. I yanked the closet door open. Inside was nothing but coats and boxes. We both let out shaky laughs, pretending it was all in our heads. But then, just as we turned to leave, we heard another sound. This time it wasn't upstairs. It was downstairs. The sound of the front door opening and closing. We froze again. Chris whispered that someone was in the house. I felt my stomach drop. We ran down the hall and crouched in my room with the lights off. I held the poker tight. We listened, and at first there was nothing. Then there were faint footsteps on the first floor. I wanted to call the police, but my phone was on the couch where we had been sitting. I whispered that maybe we could sneak out the window, but it was too small. The only way out was down the hall past the stairs. The footsteps moved closer. We heard the basement door open, then the steps went down one by one. We both exhaled in relief. Whoever it was had gone into the basement, so we took that time to run. We sprinted down the stairs through the kitchen and out the back door into the yard. We didn't stop until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, and when we told them what happened, they called the police. The officers searched my house from top to bottom. They found nothing. No signs of forced entry or anyone hiding in the basement. They told us it was probably just the house settling, or our imagination running wild while we played. But Chris and I both knew what we heard. We knew someone had been inside. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep well. Every creak made me think someone was in the hallway. That was the last time I played hide and seek ever. We're too old for it anyway. Chris and I never talked much about it again, but sometimes when we look at each other, I can tell we're both remembering that night. The night hide and seek turned into something else. Even now, years later, I still think about the sound of the closet door, the dragging noise in the carpet, and the footsteps on the first floor. We never found out who it was. Maybe a burglar who realized we were still home. Maybe someone who slipped out when we ran. All I know is that playing hide and seek that night showed us just how scary it is to realize you aren't alone in your own house. I grew up in a neighborhood that backed right up against a stretch of woods. The houses lined one side of the street, and behind them was nothing but trees for miles. When I was younger, a group of us kids from the street used to play together almost every weekend. In the summer, we stayed out late into the night, sometimes until our parents yelled for us to come home. One of our favorite games was hide and seek. We usually played in the backyards and into the edge of the woods. It was fun during the day, but at night it was different. The trees swallowed up the light and everything looked the same no matter where you were. That was what made it scary, and that was what made it fun. The last time I ever played hide and seek in those woods was when I was 14. It was August, hot and humid even at night. There were 5 of us, me, my friend Tyler, his little brother Matt, and 2 kids from down the street, Jason and Eric. We all decided to play outside because it felt cooler than sitting in someone's basement. The rule was simple. You could hide anywhere in the backyards or in the woods, but you had to stay close enough to hear when the seeker called the round over. Jason volunteered to be it first. The rest of us ran off. I went into the woods with Tyler. We split up once we passed the first row of trees. I crouched behind a fallen log, my heart beating hard even though it was just a game. I could hear Jason shouting numbers back in the yard, his voice echoing through the night. When he finished, everything went quiet. Crickets buzzed around me and the leaves rustled in the wind. I stayed low and still. After a while, I heard footsteps in the leaves. They were moving between the trees. I thought it was Jason. I held my breath and waited for him to pass. The footsteps stopped not far from me. Whoever it was stood there. I waited for them to call out or move again, but they didn't. I felt my skin prickle. I almost whispered to ask who it was, but then I remembered the rules. If I gave myself away, I would lose, so I stayed still. Finally, the steps started again. They crunched through the leaves, moving deeper into the woods. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. I peeked over the log, but it was too dark to see far. The moonlight only lit up the tops of the trees. I stayed hidden a few more minutes before I got tired of waiting. I crawled out and started creeping back toward the yards. As I walked, I heard Jason calling that the round was over and everyone should come out. I hurried back and found the others already in the yard. Jason had found Tyler and Eric, but not me or Matt. Matt came running out of the woods a minute later, covered in dirt. He laughed and said nobody would have found him. I told them that I had been behind the log and almost got caught when Jason walked right past me, but Jason looked confused. He said he never went that far into the woods. He said he only circled near the first trees and then found Tyler crouched by a fence. I squinted my eyes in confusion and then asked who it was that walked by me, but everyone just shrugged. We brushed it off and kept playing. The next round, I was seeker. I counted loud against a tree while the others scattered. When I finished, I searched the yards first. I found Eric hiding behind a shed and Tyler in the bushes. Then I went into the woods to look for Jason and Matt. The woods were quiet except for the bugs. My flashlight beam swung through the trees. I listened carefully, trying to catch movement. After a while, I spotted Matt crouched near a tree trunk. I shouted that I had him, and he ran back laughing. That left Jason. I searched deeper, calling out that I was coming. That was when I heard it again, the footsteps. The slow, heavy footsteps moving in the dark. They came from just ahead of me. I shined the flashlight that way, but the trees were thick. I walked slowly, trying not to make noise. The footsteps stopped. I waited. Now, admittedly, I was getting a little nervous. Then I heard Jason call from behind me that the round was over. I spun around. He was already walking back to the yard. Confused, I asked if he had just been ahead of me. He said no. He had been hiding closer to the house the whole time. I felt my stomach twist. Twice now I had heard someone moving through the woods who wasn't one of us. I told myself it was probably an animal, but the steps had sounded human. Too heavy to be a raccoon or a fox, even a deer. We played a few more rounds. Every time I hid, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. I kept hearing faint noises in the trees, branches snapping, leaves crunching. At one point, I even thought I saw a shadow move between the trees. But when I aimed my flashlight, it was gone. The others didn't notice anything. They just kept laughing and running. I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the nervous pit in my stomach. The last round of the night, Jason wanted to hide in the woods again. We all split up like before. I didn't want to go too far, so I stayed near the edge. I crouched low in the tall grass. I could see the faint glow of the porch lights through the trees. I heard Jason's faint voice in the distance counting. When he was done, there was once again silence. After a few minutes, I heard something that froze me in place. It was whispering. A low voice, too soft to make out the words, but it was close. My whole body tensed up. I peeked over the grass, but the woods were empty. I listened hard, but the whispering had stopped. A moment later, I heard footsteps again. They moved past me and into the trees. I lay trembling. That was when Jason called that the game was over. Everyone else came out, laughing and brushing dirt off themselves. I walked back slowly, my heart still racing. I told them I had heard someone whispering, but they all just laughed and said I was trying to scare them. I didn't argue, but I knew what I heard. We sat in Tyler's yard after that, drinking soda and talking. That was when Matt asked if anyone else had noticed the man. We all stopped and looked at him. He said while he was hiding, he thought he saw a tall man standing in the woods. He said the man didn't move, just stood there watching. Jason told him he was crazy. Eric laughed it off, but I felt sick because I believed him. We ended the night soon after. Everyone went home. I lay in bed that night, staring at my ceiling, unable to sleep. I kept hearing the whispering in my head, the slow crunch of footsteps in the leaves. I never played hide and seek in the woods again. Even now, years later, whenever I hear leaves crunch underfoot in the dark, I think back to that night. I think about that man that Matt said he saw. I think about the footsteps that weren't Jason's, and the whisper that I still can't explain. Maybe it was a stranger passing through. Maybe it was someone who lived out there. All I know is that when you hide in the dark woods, you never really know who else is hiding with you. It was a hot Saturday afternoon last July. I was 14 at the time, and I live out in the rural part of Pennsylvania. My backyard is huge. We have acres of open grass, trees, and an old storage shed at the edge of the yard. My friends and I spend almost every summer day out there. That day, it was me, Ryan, Josh, Adam. We were just messing around playing basketball on the hoop my dad put up near the garage. We played for about an hour before we were all tired and sitting in the grass, sweaty and drinking water. That's when we saw a kid we didn't recognize who came walking up from the dirt road that runs past my house. He looked about 16, older than us, taller too. He had black hair that was kind of messy and wore a gray shirt and jeans, even though it was hot out. We all stopped talking when we noticed him. He walked right up like he already knew us. He asked if we wanted to even the teams out and make it 3-on-3.
None of us answered right away. Finally, Adam asked who he was. The kid said his name was Keith. He said he lived just up the road and was just walking through the woods when he saw us. We all kind of looked at each other. I've lived here my whole life and never saw this kid once. Neither had my friends. But he acted normal enough, I guess. Ben asked him if he wanted to play basketball. Keith shook his head and suggested we play manhunt instead. He said my yard was perfect for it since there were so many spots to hide. In the moment, I don't think any of us gave that comment a second thought, but in hindsight, that should have been a red flag. How would this kid know anything about my property? We all agreed to play. It sounded more fun than standing around in the heat. We split into 2 teams. Keith immediately volunteered to be on the hunting team first. He said he loved being the seeker. So it was Keith, Adam, and Josh hunting, and me, Ryan, and Ben hiding. Adam kicked a soccer ball to signal the start. We ran off into the yard while the hunters covered their eyes and counted. Ryan took off toward the tree line. Ben sprinted for the side of the garage. I didn't want to hide in the woods yet, so I went into the storage shed. It always smells like gasoline and old wood in there. I found a pile of folded tarps in the corner, so I climbed under one and lay still. I stayed under there for at least 10 minutes, but it felt like forever. Nobody came. I started thinking maybe the hunters had given up, but then the shed door creaked open. The tarp ripped off me in one quick motion. I guess it was an obvious spot. I looked up to Adam's smiling face. We both walked back to the patio. A few minutes later, Ben showed up. He'd been caught too. Eventually, Adam and Josh walked back. We all stood around drinking water, but Keith wasn't there. At first, nobody said anything. Then Josh asked where Keith went. None of us knew. We waited another 10 minutes, thinking he'd come walking back any second, but he never did. Adam finally shrugged and said maybe he was just some weird kid and left. The rest of us agreed, even though it felt strange that he would just disappear without saying anything. When the others left around sunset, I went inside. That's when I noticed something odd near my bedroom window. On the grass was this piece of rope. It was weathered and dirty, like it had been outside for months, but I know it hadn't been there earlier. I picked it up and tossed it aside, but it stuck in my head. The first thought I had was Keith. I told myself I was overthinking, but later that evening, I couldn't stop wondering if he'd gone inside the house while we were distracted. My dad usually leaves one of the side doors unlocked during the day. I went room by room, checking closets and under beds. Nothing. That night, I got ready for bed around 11. I laid there for maybe an hour scrolling on my phone when I heard something. Soft footsteps outside my door. I froze. My dad sometimes gets up at night to use the bathroom, but he always coughs or clears his throat. This was quiet. Too quiet. I called out for my dad. No answer. I sat up with my pulse racing. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I finally got up and locked it. I stood there, staring at the handle, waiting. After about 30 seconds, I heard the front door shut. The sound carried through the whole house. I didn't waste a second. I ran to my dad's room and shook him awake. He groggily sat up while I explained what I heard. He didn't doubt me. He grabbed the shotgun from under his bed and told me to stay close. We searched the whole house together. Every closet, the basement, the garage. He even went outside and walked the property with a flashlight, but he didn't find anything. We locked every door and window after that. The next day, I told my friends, and they all laughed it off, saying Keith was probably just some weirdo passing through. But Ryan admitted he thought Keith was strange too. He said Keith barely talked during the game. He just stared at people. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, a scratching sound woke me up. It was coming from my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the blinds. The scratching was slow, like someone dragging a stick or nail against the glass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I carefully bent one of the blinds open just a crack. On the other side of the window was a figure. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of someone standing inches away in the dark. I jumped back and screamed for my dad. I ran into the hallway, shouting until he came out of his room. He didn't hesitate. He ran outside with a shotgun, firing 2 rounds into the air. I heard him yelling that he'd shoot whoever was out here if they came back. The figure at the window was gone. The rest of the night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in the living room with the lights on while my dad stayed up too. The next morning, he told me he thought Keith had been the one messing with us. He said if that kid showed up again, he'd shoot him. I know he wasn't fully serious, but that's just how my dad is. He said that kid isn't welcome anywhere near our house ever again. As far as I know, Keith never came back. But sometimes when I'm outside at night, I think about that rope by my window, and I wonder what he was planning to do if I hadn't woken up when I did. So I've actually got 2 stories that I think are worth hearing, and they're both related to each other. My name is David. I used to work late nights at a gas station / convenience store out in the middle of nowhere. This was forever ago, which I'm only mentioning because it was back before every establishment had state-of-the-art security systems and cameras covering every square inch of their property. It's not like security systems didn't exist, more so that it wasn't much of a priority. Plus, the owner was cheap. But anyway, I didn't care because the job was laughably easy. The most difficult part of working there was honestly the owner. He legitimately had the mind of a goldfish. We'd have the same 2 arguments multiple times a week, and it was almost like this guy forgot what we argued about every time because he'd constantly repeat himself and bring up things we'd already addressed. But whatever. Here's everything you need to know. Most nights, it was just me in there from 11 p.m. to 7 in the morning, and the place didn't see much traffic. That's about it. Anyway, one night, I'm pretty sure it was during the week, I was doing what I always did, leaning against the counter with a magazine in hand, trying to prevent the boredom from putting me to sleep. It was really late. I don't remember exactly what time it was, since the store had the remarkable ability to blend all the ungodly hours of the night into one lump of misery. But the store was dead silent. You know that faint buzzing noise those old fluorescent lights make? That was the only noise I'd hear in hours, and my brain had gotten numb to it, which I guess explains why I was so startled when the front door chimed. I looked up, and there was a man walking in. He was this tall, 30-something looking black guy with an above-average build. My first thought was ex-pro athlete, but then I looked at him a little more closely. Here's the thing, and I can't overstate how jarring this was. He was quite literally covered in blood, or I guess it could have been red paint, but I knew it wasn't. It was everywhere. There was a huge splatter across his chest for one, not to mention the streaks on his face and arms. It was a cartoonish amount of blood, which is why my brain took so long to process it. It was one of those unique sights that paralyzes your brain for a few moments because it doesn't fit any familiar category of lived experience. But what really got me were his eyes. They were just empty. I don't know how else to describe them. There was nothing behind them. It legit looked like he was just walking into the gas station at 2 a.m. on any other night. He looked perfectly normal, like he was relaxed and almost bored. It was like he didn't even know he was drenched in what was very clearly blood. I'm describing all of this in vivid detail so that my reaction makes sense. I don't want to come across as some pathetic loser. It was genuinely a terrifying situation. I was completely frozen, and all I could do was stare at the guy, which was probably the last thing I wanted to be doing. I couldn't help myself. Every time I was able to look away, my gaze immediately snapped right back to his eyes. He noticed, obviously, which wasn't too surprising. I mean, I was quite literally staring at him. I'm not sure what I was expecting him to do, but I definitely was not expecting him to smile at me. And then he said, calm as anything, "Don't worry, it's not my blood." As if that was supposed to make me feel any better. It didn't. My brain immediately started the emergency alarms, that this guy is a murderer. He might have just killed someone. He might kill me. Those were the only thoughts running through my brain, and I was freaking the fuck out. But then my survival instincts kicked in, and I started acting like everything was normal. I nodded at him like he had said something normal about the weather, and I buried my head back in the magazine. I watched him walk through the aisles like nothing was wrong. He grabbed some random stuff and came up to pay. I was actually kind of surprised that he wasn't going to just steal the items. I probably would have let him. I rang him up, careful not to look him in the eyes. The nightmare was almost over. He paid in cash, didn't say anything else, and left. The door chimed and he was gone, as simply as that. The second I heard a car engine start somewhere out in the parking lot, I grabbed the phone and called 911. I told them what I saw, and I tried to describe the guy as accurately as possible. I told them I didn't really know what had happened, but I was positive that something happened. The dispatcher was asking some clarifying questions when everything went sideways. I was mid-sentence when the door chimed again. Great, another customer. That was the last thing I wanted to deal with, but I was wrong. It wasn't another customer. It was him again, the guy I was in the middle of reporting to the police. He looked absolutely furious. I hung up the phone as fast as I could, but it was too late. He knew what I was doing. He must have seen me through the window. He stormed up to the counter and started demanding to know if I'd called the cops. I denied it, but he wasn't buying it. Not even a little. Things escalated quickly. He started cursing at me, telling me to mind my business and that he knew I was lying. I just put my hands up and didn't say anything, trying to defuse things as best I could, but there was nothing I could do. His voice was getting louder, and those empty eyes were suddenly filled with rage. At first, I thought he was just going to yell at me, but I saw it a second too late. He jumped across the counter and attacked me before I could do anything. I don't mean he climbed over it. I mean he launched himself across the counter and tackled me to the ground before I could even react. In all of 2 seconds, he went from screaming at me to strangling me, and I was fighting for my life. I thought I was going to die. I had never been in a physical altercation before that night, and I was certain this guy was trying to end my life. I thrashed around wildly, kicking, scratching, biting even. I was just trying to survive. I could feel his blood, or whoever's blood it was, all over me, smearing my clothes and face. We were still rolling around on the floor when I resorted to my final option. I screamed that I had a gun, and I wasn't afraid to use it. A complete bluff, of course. Something about the way I said it must have been convincing, though, because he stopped punching me. He scrambled off and bolted for the door. I was still on the ground in a painful haze when I heard his car speed out of the parking lot. I didn't even get up at first. I just laid there for a while, covered in a mix of someone else's and my blood. The police showed up maybe 10 minutes later. When they saw the state I was in, they immediately left and tried to track the guy down. I never heard from them again. There was nothing about it on the news either, so I was completely in the dark. The experience was by far the scariest physical thing that has ever happened to me. Okay, if you thought that was crazy, I promise you this one's worse. A few months after the first incident, I was still working at the same gas station, which was probably my first mistake considering what happened. But I needed the money. Also, there was a part of me that had convinced myself it was just a freak occurrence. A one-time thing that had no chance of ever happening again. But that's not the case. It was another late night when the next thing happened. Looking back, the circumstances surrounding the night were pretty much identical to that of the first incident. It was a late night, I was alone in the store, dying of boredom, etc. So anyway, this guy walks in the store and immediately catches my eye. The first strange thing I noticed was that he was wearing a suit, and not just any suit. This thing looked expensive. It was dark gray and perfectly tailored. He had no business being anywhere near a gas station past midnight dressed like that. My first thought was that he must be coming from a wedding, or maybe some kind of corporate event. I mean, there had to be some kind of explanation for what he was doing. But even important people don't walk into gas stations in the middle of nowhere wearing nice suits. That just doesn't really happen, and I would know. The guy didn't browse or even so much as glance at the aisles. He clearly wasn't hiding his intentions, or just didn't care enough to. Instead, he walked right up to me. He didn't speak or even look at me. He just reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a photograph. At first, I was beyond confused, but then I looked down at the picture, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a picture of that guy who had come into the store with blood all over himself and tried to kill me. The photo wasn't 100% clear, but I was sure it was unmistakably the same person. I tried to mask my surprise, but I don't think I did a good job. I kept my face glued to the photo, but I could feel that man watching me. He didn't say anything at first, and when I looked up to meet his gaze, he just stared at me, like he was studying my face or reading my mind. I wasn't sure if he was expecting me to say something, so I didn't. It was painfully awkward, and then, after a really uncomfortably long pause, he finally spoke. His voice was surprisingly gruff, almost like he had just smoked a full pack of cigarettes. He asked me if I had ever seen that man before, and I immediately said I hadn't. It felt like the right answer, even if I couldn't explain it at the time. I just didn't want to get involved in any kind of illicit activity that was going on, and my gut was screaming, "Deny, deny, deny." The guy didn't respond. He just kept staring at me with these cold, calculating eyes that I couldn't read. It was really unnerving, especially given what he was asking me about. The silence was excruciating, and with every passing second, I lost confidence in the believability of my lie. Still though, I wasn't budging, and I was still pretty sure I had given a convincing answer. I won our little implicit standoff, and the guy finally reached down and picked up the photograph. As soon as he turned his back, I let out a huge sigh of relief, thinking everything was over. I watched him walk through the store toward the door, but right before he opened it, he stopped, and he turned back around to face me one more time, and then he just said, "I know you're lying." And then, before I could even respond, he was gone. I was pretty shocked by the whole encounter, more than I wanted to admit to myself. Being in that store all alone didn't feel safe anymore, and I didn't really know what to think. For the life of me, I couldn't figure out what the hell had just happened. Who was that guy? How did he know about the first incident? I wondered if he was a cop or detective, or if he was something else entirely, someone connected to whatever that blood-covered man had been involved in. That's the thought that really freaked me out. I pretty quickly reasoned that if he had been someone official like a cop, he would have revealed his identity to me, which could only signify bad news. I didn't end up calling the police that time, partly because I wasn't sure what I'd even say, and partly because of the PTSD over what happened the last time I called the police. Nothing happened for a while after that night, though. I was a little shaken, yeah, and part of me was expecting something else to happen that night, but nothing did. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I started thinking something might have actually been wrong. I started noticing the same silver SUV in various spots throughout my day. At first, it was parked across the street from the gas station during my daytime shifts, which was normal enough, but then I noticed it in the parking lot of the grocery store I went to, which was a touch stranger. Once I saw it on my street, the alarm bells started to go off again. I'm not a paranoid person by nature, but when you see the same vehicle in several different locations over the course of 2 weeks, you start to wonder. I had a feeling I knew who it was, and I told myself the next time I saw the car, I would call the police and report it as discreetly as possible. I knew it was that guy who had walked into the store that night in a suit. It had to be him. The worst part about it all was not knowing how he'd figured out where I lived. Somehow he tracked me down. You have to remember, I lived alone at the time. It's not like I had protection at home or a lot of people to consult on this. I don't know why, but I convinced myself things would blow over if I just ignored it. And of course, that was an awful way to proceed. About 3 weeks after he'd first shown up, I was jerked awake in the middle of the night by the sound of glass shattering. My first reaction wasn't to freeze or flee, but to fight. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and ran into the living room. There was no one there, which I was able to determine in just a few minutes because the house was pretty small. There was something, though. There, sitting in the middle of the living room floor, surrounded by broken glass, was a rock. Just a plain rock, maybe the size of a fist. There was no note attached to it, but I understood what it meant. In that moment, I realized I couldn't do this anymore. That guy had clearly been stalking me, and he was clearly involved in something awful and was trying to tell me something. I didn't know what that thing was, but I knew I wanted no part of it, so I caved. I quit my job the next day and started looking for other places to live. It took me a little over a month to find a nondescript apartment a few towns over, and I figured that was good enough. In that moment, I didn't see the SUV one time, but my mind was made up, and nothing happened after that. I was finally at peace, and I was actually able to find another job relatively easily. I ended up moving again not even a year later, this time way out of state, and that was that. But I still think about both experiences from time to time. Even though the first encounter was probably more life-threatening, it's the second one that gets me. I was never able to figure out why someone would go through all that trouble, stalking, harassment, intimidation, just because I'd called the cops on someone covered in blood. The only explanation I could think of was that he somehow thought I had a connection to that first guy, and I was harboring him or sheltering him or something. It's been years, and I've accepted that I'll probably never figure out the truth behind any of what happened. This happened about 8 months ago. The night in question, I was heading back from a job site about 3 hours from my house. I was beat. The job had taken longer than expected, and I didn't have the amount of caffeine in my system such exhausting work required. By the time I got back on the road, it was already past 10. I know a 3-hour drive doesn't sound too intense, but I had been working so hard that even the simple task of keeping my eyes open was a chore. Plus, my truck is several years old. I don't drive a fancy vehicle with assisted driving or anything like that, so it's not like I had the comfort of knowing my car would help with the drive. About 45 minutes in, I knew I needed to stop. My eyelids were doing that thing where they just kind of drift down on their own, and I was having to physically shake my head to stay alert. So I pulled into the next gas station off the highway. It was around 11 at that point. I filled up my tank, smoked a cigarette, and kind of stood there debating what to do. I still had over 2 hours of driving ahead of me, and I knew there was no way I'd make it. So I made the decision to take a quick nap and finish the drive afterward. I drove to the corner of the parking lot and turned my engine off. I was just going to go to sleep for a few hours right there. I've slept in worse places, it didn't seem like a big deal. I was out almost instantly. When my alarm went off, it felt like I had blinked and an hour had passed. I still wasn't fully rested, but I was definitely more alert than before, which was good enough for me. The lot was completely empty now. There had been at least 2 other cars there when I pulled in, and they were both gone. Without as much as a second thought, I started my truck and pulled back onto the highway. Things were fine for maybe the first 20 minutes. The highway was dead, and I was kind of zoning out. Not falling asleep per se, but just letting muscle memory take over. I was essentially on autopilot. At one point, I realized my truck was making some strange noises. It actually took my brain a few minutes to process what I was hearing as abnormal. That's how zoned out I was. I turned the AC down so I could hear things more clearly. There was this faint thumping sound coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around a few times, but didn't see any loose items bouncing around in the back seat or anything like that. I figured it was just something shifting around in the truck bed. One of my tools, maybe. Beyond speculating, there wasn't much else I could do. The situation didn't really warrant me pulling over, so I made a mental note to check it when I got back home, and I kept driving. The sounds continued, though. It actually started to bother me, and I ended up cranking the radio to drown it out. At one point, I slammed my hand against the hood of the truck and cursed out of frustration. Strangely, that seemed to work. For maybe 10 minutes after that, things were quiet. I was relieved, not because the noise was worrying me, but because it was genuinely ticking me off. The adrenaline from getting so worked up had woken me up a bit more, which was a good thing. But that increased alertness also cleared some of the brain fog, and I started thinking about how odd it was for a sound being made by an inanimate object to stop so abruptly as a result of my outburst. I had already eliminated the possibility that a faulty part in my truck had been making the sound, so the fact that slapping the hood could have caused it to stop was such a weird coincidence. I was in my head about it, debating whether I should stop or not, when out of nowhere, I heard a deafening crack come from directly behind me. It was not a normal sound, and it definitely wasn't a normal crack either. It was more like a crash, like someone had thrown a rock against one of my windows. The next 30 seconds were pure chaos and terror. I turned around in shock, and what I saw nearly made me lose control of my vehicle. There was a person standing in my truck bed, banging on the glass divider between the truck bed and the back seat with one of my tools. It was dark, but I could clearly see him. He was banging on the glass repeatedly. like a wild animal trying to claw its way out of a cage. The way he was moving was truly barbaric. I can't overstate that enough. I swerved uncontrollably, partly out of fear and partly to try and shake him off. I lost control of the truck and started spinning out of control. I genuinely thought I was going to flip, but all I could think about was the maniac who was trying to smash his way through the glass. I somehow managed to wrestle the truck back under control, and I skidded to a halt halfway between the right lane and the shoulder. I was too disoriented and terrified to think about how lucky I had been to avoid a wreck. And the moment my head stopped spinning, I ripped off my seatbelt. I don't know what came over me. I'm not the bravest person, and I wasn't armed, but I knew I wanted to do something. I couldn't just sit there. I had to confront the psycho in the truck bed, if he was even still there. I threw the door open and ran around the truck. As I was approaching the truck bed, I saw a man in a hoodie climbing out. He jumped onto the ground and started running for the tree line off the side of the highway. I chased him for a few seconds before realizing that was a terrible decision. It was pitch black out there. I had no idea if he was armed, and we were completely alone. Wherever my bout of confidence had come from, it didn't last. In a matter of seconds, I was terrified all over again. I ran back to my truck and sped off without even looking back to see where that guy went. I drove for a little while and then pulled over again to inspect the damage to my truck. My brain was genuinely in shock. I couldn't think straight, and I started to feel what I can only describe as a panic attack. I calmed myself down and got out of the truck. The glass divider was destroyed. It wasn't completely shattered, but there were so many cracks in it that one more forceful impact would have taken it out. I climbed into the bed of my truck to see what he had been hitting the glass with, but something caught my attention before I could even figure it out. There was a foreign object in there that I didn't recognize. It definitely wasn't a tool. It took me a few seconds to realize what I was looking at. It was a trash bag. It was wrapped over on itself multiple times, like someone had been trying to keep it really secure. And it was small too, like the size of 2 fists. It looked wet, and as I crouched down to get a better look, I realized it smelled disgusting. It smelled rancid, like rotting meat or food. I didn't want to touch it, but I needed it out of my truck. I needed to be as far away from that bag as possible. So as gingerly as I could, I grabbed it and quickly chucked it toward the tree line. I didn't give things another thought. I immediately got back in the driver's seat and started driving away. As I was pulling out, I looked down at my hands and realized they were tinted slightly red. The bag had been coated in something red. Something red that was now all over my hands. It was sickening, but there was nothing I could do besides drive. I rubbed my hands on my jeans and tried to just make it home without going insane. I ended up keeping the incident to myself. I didn't involve the police, and it wasn't until weeks later that I even told my friends about what happened. I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter for days afterwards. I got a friend of mine to fix my glass a few days later without asking questions, and that was pretty much that. But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't affected by what happened. Looking back, the only explanation that makes sense is that he climbed into the bed of my truck while I was asleep at the gas station, which makes sense because I don't have a bed cover. But he must have been lying completely flat there for most of the drive too, otherwise I would have seen him. I've never been in a life or death situation like that before. It was by far the most terrifying thing I've ever gone through. I went to a bar with a couple friends one Saturday night. We got really drunk and eventually all spread out throughout the bar as we went to talk to different people. Long story short, I was having a bad night, and I wasn't feeling the whole bar scene really. I called an Uber home, which was about 15 minutes away. The Uber pulled up, but instead some old, crappy-looking 2003 or something Honda Accord pulls up in front of the bar. I knocked on the window and asked, "Mike?" He nodded, so I got in the passenger seat, only because the front seat was covered with books and other stuff that appeared to be junk. In fact, the entire car was messy, the back seats too. He didn't seem like the kind of Uber driver to joke around and make conversation with. He was on the older side, not that old, but his hair was thinning, and based on what I could see of his face, he looked kind of unfriendly.
so I kept silent. I was pretty drunk though, so I barely remember what I was doing. Probably drunk texting people and whatnot. I'm telling you, I was blackout drunk because I don't remember even getting out of the car. All I really remember is waking up the next morning and realizing my phone was missing. I checked everywhere. I practically turned my whole room upside down looking for it. Eventually, after hours of searching, I came to the unfortunate acceptance that I must have lost my phone the night before. I had my brother text all my friends asking if they had my phone. All of them said no. Then I remembered I recently activated Find My iPhone. I excitedly told my brother to track my phone using the Find My iPhone app. Sure enough, my iPhone came up on the map. It was a few miles away, on the much worse side of town, the part of town everyone knew not to go to. My brother agreed to come with me, not only to help track the phone, but to serve as backup if needed. We pulled up to what appeared to be the house that the iPhone on the map was sitting over. It was a small box-like house. 2 windows in front, 1 window on the upper level. It was either 8 or 9 p.m., still early, so my brother and I went ahead and rang the doorbell. It didn't seem like the bell worked though, so I knocked really hard on the door. We could actually hear footsteps on a creaky wood floor approaching the front door, then silence. There was a peephole in the door, so I had a feeling someone was watching us through it at that very moment. After an uncomfortably long silence, the door cracked open and someone asked who it is in a very raspy, almost familiar voice. We mentioned the lost iPhone situation. At first he played dumb, but when I turned to the driveway and recognized the old Honda Accord, I called him out for being my Uber driver and that I must have dropped my phone in his car. At this point he opened the door fully and revealed himself to indeed be my Uber driver. Now he acted like he remembered, but his whole persona and everything was disturbing. He clearly didn't know what social cues were, or forget that, he clearly just didn't know what social skills were. He told us to come in and shut the door behind us. Then he told us to wait there while he went upstairs to find my phone. I thanked him, and as creepy as the guy was, I felt relieved that I'd be getting my phone back. My brother and I stood in the tiny hallway of this man's tiny house. It was so archaic inside. The finishing, the design, everything. The floral wallpaper covering all of the walls looked like it belonged in a house built in the 1930s. The stairs that the man walked up were creaky and sounded like they were ready to collapse. We heard the man walking around upstairs for a bit. The creakiness followed his every step until we heard him stop directly overhead. My brother and I patiently played the waiting game, with my checking my watch every minute or so. He seemed to be up there for a total of 10 minutes. My brother and I got so impatient at this point that we started calling up the stairs asking the man if he needed help. We heard a slight creak in the floor right above us again, but he didn't call back. My brother told me to go upstairs and check if he needed help, so I hesitantly did. As I got halfway up the stairs, I realized it was insanely dark up there, which made me wonder how he could even possibly be looking for my phone. I got to the top. There seemed to be 3 open doors, one leading to a bathroom, the other 2 leading to bedrooms. All the lights were off except for a little hallway nightlight. I called out for the man again, to no avail. I called down the stairs to my brother, saying that all the lights were off and something wasn't right. He didn't answer for some reason. I checked the bathroom, empty. I was about to check one of the bedrooms, passing the door to the bathroom, but I stopped when I saw something through the crack of the bathroom door. The man, he was hiding behind the door, holding something in his hand. I felt like he was looking at me, but I didn't look for more than a second. I looked away and pretended I didn't notice. I had to get downstairs ASAP. I nervously called out to the man that I'd be going downstairs and that I'd be right back. I walked with a certain speed and jumped my step right to the stairs, at which point I booked it and screamed for my brother to follow me. My brother emerged from one of the other rooms downstairs after apparently snooping around, and without questioning it, followed me outside to the car. We drove down the block as I explained in full what happened. The next thing we did was dial 911 for the police. An officer showed up to the house where we returned, showed the officer the Find My iPhone app screen, and knocked on the door with the officer. The man would eventually answer, and the officer forced the man to fetch the phone. This time he did without hesitation. He went up the stairs and 10 seconds later came back down. My brother and I begged the officer to arrest him or do something, given that he looked as if he were waiting to strike me as he was behind that door. The officer said there was nothing he could do though, and I swear as I said this, the Uber driver looked at me with the most disgusting, disturbing, and evil stare I'd ever seen. I gave him the middle finger and turned away as we left the house, which felt good slightly, but I still get scared thinking about seeing that man behind that door, very clearly holding something in his hand, most likely waiting to attack me if I were to see him. Before I got an iPhone 10, I used to have an iPhone 7. I was perfectly fine with that phone and I never got a scratch on it. I'd probably still have that phone now if I didn't lose it. I always had the Find My iPhone feature enabled, however, just in case if I did lose it, I'd be able to track it. To this day, I still don't remember how or where I lost the phone. All I remember is I came home one day, quickly realized I didn't have my phone on me, and had a mini heart attack. I searched the whole house, my car, the pathway up to the house. I even drove back to all the locations I was in that night to look for it, but I couldn't find it anywhere. Then I remembered I could sign into my iCloud account from my laptop and track my iPhone using the Find My iPhone setting. So I drove home and did just that. Apparently my phone was coming up somewhere in the woods at the end of the village. None of my siblings were home at the time. They were all away at school, so I couldn't ask any of them to come with me, so it looked like I was heading out alone. My dad didn't want me to come because he had work early the next morning, but he let me take his phone with me to track my phone. It was a quick 5 to 10 minute drive to the woods. I parked on the grass on the side of the road. It seemed like I was maybe a minute walk north away. Obviously I brought my flashlight expecting to be following the trail into the woods. Now that I stood there though, the idea of going in there was a lot less appealing. In fact, the whole situation seemed more suspicious, such as why whoever found my phone would be in the middle of the dark woods at 10 o'clock. I definitely shouldn't have come alone, but at this point I didn't see much more of a choice than following the trail. The flashlight I had sucked. It barely lit up the trail 5 feet in front of me. Eventually it seemed like I was right on the mark of the location for my phone. I did a full 360 examining my surroundings, but seeing nothing but darkness and trees. I started yelling for somebody to come out. It was the first time I heard my own voice in an hour, and it came out weak and unintimidating. When I called out, I heard a whispering come from beyond a few trees, in the east direction on my map. I yelled out again. Silence this time now. I started sending texts with my dad's phone to my phone, and I heard the dings coming from the same direction as the whispering. I looked in that direction and saw the glow of a phone screen so bright that it lit up the figures of 2, maybe 3 men standing behind a line of trees. At that exact moment, I had a realization in my head that I was in way over my head being in those woods alone, and that my iPhone was in no way worth risking my life. I turned the flashlight off and ran back down the trail as fast as I could, back to my car. By the time I got back, my phone could no longer be located on the Find My iPhone app, meaning it was either broken, disconnected, or turned off. I have checked a few times since then if the phone comes up on the map. It never has though. I think I made the right choice running away. I don't think any possession would be worth approaching a group of people like that in the woods. I recently lost my iPhone. It was a 5C, a really old one. I was due for another one anyway, but let me tell you the story of how I lost it. I had admittedly been drinking one night on the weekends, and at some point in the night I lost my phone. Later on in the night, when my friends and I sobered up a bit, I asked one of my friends to let me use their phone to track mine using the Find My iPhone thing. It wasn't too far actually, only a mile away from us, but that meant someone took my phone. My friend Ryan and I took a drive to this abandoned warehouse building. Of course, it had to be an abandoned building. We found a way inside, with only Rye's phone flashlight to use for navigation. The place was cold, full with trash and rubble, and every little sound created an echo. We heard yelling coming from upstairs, from what sounded like two people. Rye and I figured one of them had to have my phone, so still, with a slight amount of liquid confidence in us, we found a stairway that led to the next level. We came to a hallway, which was disturbingly silent. The only thing to break the silence was a bang from a nearby locker room type area. Rye and I both tried hard to make our presence known so that we wouldn't surprise any potentially dangerous people. We entered this kind of changing room area, or whatever it was, but it had a bunch of lockers. No one was in the room. Rye started checking the lockers out of desperation, which made a lot of noise, I guess, because we heard a deep voice from another room call us over and said that they had what we were looking for. I was about to walk into the adjacent room, but Rye put his hand on my shoulder to stop me and put his finger on his lips as he went, "Shh." He was doing something on his phone. I didn't know what until I heard my ringtone and the vibration of my phone coming from one of the lockers. There were too many to distinguish quick enough which one it could be. I started checking the ones where the sound could have been coming from before Rye pulled me by the arm and told me, "Let's go." I told him, "Wait, let me get my phone first," but he kept saying, "No, let's go." By the time we got to the car, we had a long discussion about what was going down in there, or what was about to go down. Rye was positive we were walking straight into a trap. How he was so sure was because as I was checking the lockers for my phone, he spotted someone's head behind one of the walls to the adjacent room. They were peering their head in just barely, making it obvious they were hiding and had questionable intentions. It wasn't the end of the world. It was an old iPhone that wouldn't have been worth much anyway. It was much better to escape with our wallets, or even our lives instead. It happened on a night that I was the designated driver among my group of friends after a party. My friends were Michael, Eddie, and Daniela. We live in the country, so anytime we wanted to go to the bars or parties, we'd have to travel long distances. That's why it's such a big deal for one of us to be sober enough to drive. We were driving down the 513, which is an unlit highway littered with the occasional house or two, but mostly forest. The road leads to town where most of the bars are. This story takes place on the way back from town. Daniela started to cry that she had to piss really bad. I told her she'd have to wait a while longer, but not gonna lie, I started to get the urge as well. That mixed with the fact that Daniela was now screaming in her drunken fit, I figured why not pull over to the side of the road and just piss somewhere in the woods. Daniela got out first and disappeared into the crops on one side. I went to the opposite side of the road and slightly into the woods just because I'm the type of person who can't have people watching me piss. I finished first and got back in the car. Eddie and Michael were singing to the roaring rap music playing on the radio, while I pretty much just sat there in silence, growing impatient. My two drunk friends didn't seem to find anything strange about the fact that Daniela had now been gone for 5 minutes, so I got back out to call her name. Michael has a much stronger voice than I, so when he screamed for her, it would be impossible for her not to hear. But still, she didn't call back. I didn't want to go in those crops, but I kind of felt like I had to since she's my friend, and I was the most aware at that moment. I forced Michael to come with since I was afraid to go in alone. Eddie stayed in the car, he was just too far gone at this point. With the flashlight from my glove box, Michael and I pushed our way through the thick, overgrown crops, walking in the only direction we could think to go, straight away from the car. Michael was calling Danielle's name while laughing his ass off. I could understand why he was finding it funny in his condition, but I just wanted to make sure she was alright and get home. Over the sounds of her own footsteps brushing crops aside and Michael's laughter, I heard something else in the near vicinity. I put my arm out to Michael's chest to halt him. Now all that could be heard was the night breeze blowing through the crops. "What is it?" Michael whispered, to which I responded, "Shh." "That." Michael called out Daniela's name again. I joined in, figuring it was just her trying to sneak up on us and scare us. And again, the footsteps stopped. So we walked a little deeper into the crops. That's when we came to a narrow clearing stretch. I don't know much about crops and farming or anything, but it seemed to be some little stretch for people to walk through. It was probably the width of 2 people, just enough to walk through. I looked to my left, as far down as the light would let me see, and then to the right. I could hear 3 footsteps, and then a couple crops pushed outward into the opening as somebody stepped into view. At first my light was only revealing their legs, so by default under the circumstances I assumed it was Michael. However, the light revealed it to be not Michael, but instead some random man who I'd never seen before. His facial features weren't clear enough to give a good description, but he didn't look friendly. I ran for it back in the only direction I remembered coming from. I guess I ran so fast that it only took me about 10 seconds to make it back to the car. Eddie was passed out in the car at this point, so I didn't bother trying to get help from him. I was honking the horn to get Michael's and hopefully Daniela's attention. The sight of that man just disturbed me. I didn't know if he owned this land or not. I continued to lay on the horn until finally, Michael came out of the crops dragging Daniela, who seemed to be out cold. I got out to help him lift her back inside of the car and plop her on the seat. Michael pointed out the gash on her forehead, as if she had been struck with a heavy, sharp object. Michael seemed to be sobering up pretty quickly due to the situation. He advised I drive to the nearest hospital, which was 10 minutes away. The drive there was not fun. It was full of panic and yelling. We brought Daniela in to have her wound treated as soon as possible. It was only then that Michael explained to the nurses, not me, that he saw some guy dragging her collapsed, unconscious body before fleeing deeper into the crops after noticing him. He never mentioned that in the car, but it made perfect sense now. That man in the crops with us that night did this. Daniela was awake after she got all stitched up, and she had no recollection of the entire night, from the moment we stepped into the party to the moment she got struck in the head. 12:17, according to the green clock shining bright from my car's dashboard. I still remember that number as I was driving home from the night shift at the pharmacy I worked at. Taking the highway at this hour is a little dangerous since there's no lights, usually no other cars at that hour, and commonly deer would walk out onto the road, and you wouldn't notice them until it'd be too late if they were in your direct path. That's why I always drive slow on it, 50 max. As the road curved to the left, a clear row of reflective lights appeared in the horizon, which I quickly realized was the reflective tape of a row of traffic cones, as well as a flashing blue light in the distance. In front of them seemed to be the reflective material on a safety vest. I was so confused trying to figure out what the hell this was about that it didn't even hit me that I should be slamming on the brakes until it was almost too late. The car came to a halting stop as the horrid screeching of my tires stopped, and the man wearing the reflective vest started walking over to my car, arms out waving. I guess he was telling me not to move the car. As the man got closer, I could see what appeared to be a police uniform under the vest. He knocked on my window with the joint of his pointer finger, so I took that as lower your window. I rolled down the window, better revealing the man's face. To give a good description, he was black, about 6 foot, skinny, slight stubble, and a left earring. He was kind of young, I'd have to guess around 25. He spoke in a very low, non-commanding voice, especially for an officer. He said, "License and registration, please." I paused for a second and asked if I did something wrong, because I definitely wasn't speeding. He paused as well and looked slightly to the left and then back at me. "Sir, this is a sobriety checkpoint," he said in once again a very non-commanding voice. I asked why he would need my ID and registration then if I had not yet been suspected of anything. He leaned back from my car and asked me to step out of the vehicle to begin the test. I opened my door and stepped out. Immediately I noticed the cop towered over me in height. He took a roll of tape out from his vest pocket and laid it down onto the ground, stretching it to a length of about 15 feet. He told me to step on the end of the roll of tape and place my arms out to my sides as I walk across the tape in a straight line. I easily did it with no issues, with the cop directly behind me the whole time, uncomfortably close. When I got to the end of the roll of tape, I could more easily see that blue flashing light. It wasn't sitting on top of a police car, it was sitting on some older, small sedan. I looked back at him and asked to see his badge, and he just looked at me with the blankest stare. It started to sink in, and I literally mean that, because I felt like my heart was sinking. This guy wasn't a cop. He said something next that I couldn't quite distinguish at first, but as he got to his car, I assumed he said, "I'll go get it 1 second." He was bent over into his car grabbing something. While he was distracted, I ran back to the car. He looked at me as I started the car and raised a gun up to me. It goes without saying I put the pedal to the floor as the car jumped into an acceleration through the traffic cones. I saw the headlights of the guy's car go on as I was a few hundred feet away, but at that point I was already going over 60, and there was no way he'd be catching me. I got off at the next exit, and as soon as there were street lights around, I turned off my car lights to draw less attention as I finished the drive to my house. I only wish I had a dash cam at the time so I could have gotten it on video. I swear it would have wound up on the news. I was taking a drive from Maine to Upper New York to spend the week with family. I left right after work around 5:30, so I didn't anticipate getting there until past 1 in the morning. I had the top to my Jeep Wrangler off so I could enjoy the hot weather. I was somewhere in Vermont well past midnight when the gas light flicked on and the car started beeping. Unfortunately, the gas gauge in the car was broken, so there was no way to gauge how much gas was left. I was told by my brother, who drove the car the previous day, that he filled it up to the top, but clearly he was either mistaken or lying, because I had not used anywhere near a full tank's worth of gas. One of those blue service signs zoomed past. I could see a gas station symbol in one of the boxes, so I turned off that exit onto a desolate road, which surely led to some kind of civilization. I wouldn't be finding out anytime soon, however, because the car started jittering and bumping around a bit, making weird noises that didn't sound good at all. A few seconds later, the acceleration stopped, and the car came to a helpless halt. I couldn't believe it, but I actually ran out of gas. I hopped out of the car and got on the phone with AAA, telling them my exact location. They said they could have a guy out to me in at least 20 minutes. I was grateful, but at the same time annoyed that I'd be waiting now for at least 20 minutes. For about 15 minutes, I kind of just strolled around my car slowly, looking down at my phone, texting friends about the situation, and checking social medias. It was so quiet. No sounds of distant traffic, no passing cars, just the sound of crickets and other night creatures in the woods. Then, I heard something walking around in the woods. The footsteps were decently heavy, so I had a hunch it was a deer or something. But the possibility of it being a bear wasn't far-fetched, given that this was bear country. I walked around to the passenger side of the car now, where the woods were, and where the sounds were coming from, just in hopes of seeing a deer or some other harmless animal. Then there were 2 clapping sounds. Like, it actually sounded like a person clapping their hands. I moved a little closer to listen for it again. This time it was 3 claps. I called out to the woods, hoping in some weird way that someone would answer. But after I did, the clapping didn't happen anymore. I just stood there waiting for something to happen, but it was just silence. So I got back in the car and just waited. I heard footsteps once again coming from the woods, coming in my direction. Then it just stopped. I looked outside and saw it. The head, peeking from behind a tree, just ahead. It almost looked lifeless. The eyes, they just looked so lifeless I couldn't even tell if they were looking at me or not. I was so focused on these details, I didn't even think to scream at the horror of what I was witnessing. I cranked the windows up on both sides and turned off the headlights. However, hiding in the car didn't make me feel much safer since the entire top was off. Without the headlights on, there was complete darkness. I couldn't see 2 inches in front of me, yet I was surrounded by the night noises of the forest. I was ducking down below the dashboard, doors locked yet still completely exposed to the outside, praying not to hear any sudden sounds like footsteps. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach, however, as I heard someone grab the car door handle. I tried my best not to move or make any noise. I was waiting for someone to start pounding at the glass, or at the very least reach around the opening behind the front door to just unlock it. I was so exposed it wasn't even funny. And then, I felt a hand aggressively grab onto my back. I simply lost it and screamed at the top of my lungs. But suddenly the hand released its grip on my shirt as light began to fill the area, and the sound of a truck engine pulling up the road was music to my ears. I sat up and turned around to see the headlights of a AAA truck, but whoever was grabbing me was long gone already. I ran outside to greet the man who stepped out. He was a big dude in his 40s. I basically cried to him about what just happened, taking huge breaths in between each sentence. Something about his personality and presence was just calming and reassuring, however. He filled my car up with gas and we both went on our ways. Even though something about that man's aura just calmed me down, the memory of what happened that night is still haunting, and the image of that lifeless head peering around that tree is imprinted in my brain.